The Quirk Bestower. Act 1. Chapter 1. Izuku Midoriya was 4 years old when the doctor confirmed what his mother already feared. No extra joint in his toe. No hidden switch waiting to flip on. Quirkless, the file said, the same word that had ended 1,000 other small dreams in the exact same room. What the doctor did not know, what no machine in that clinic could measure, was that Izuku's blood carried something that had never been catalogued before. It was not a quirk in the way the world understood the term. It did not manifest as fire from his palms or steel beneath his skin. It manifested only when his skin met someone else's, and even then, only when that someone let him close enough to mean it. For years it slept. Izuku grew up cataloging heroes in tattered notebooks, memorizing movesets and battle records, aching with a hunger to matter in a world that measured worth by the power written into a person's bones. He was quirkless, and so he was, by the rules of that world, worth less. He believed it the way children believe the sky is blue, without ever needing to be told twice. The truth came out on a rooftop when he was 15, in the middle of the worst day of his life, and it came out because of a girl no one else had bothered to notice. Her name was Himiko Tsukishima, and she was not the blood-drinking villain of another timeline. In this one she was simply a first year at a school 2 train stops from Izuku's, quirkless like him, bullied for it in ways that left bruises nobody photographed. She had climbed to the roof of her school not to escape a villain, but to escape everyone else, and Izuku had been walking home along the service road below when he heard her crying. He did not think about it. That was the strange thing he would tell people later, when they asked how it started. He did not calculate the risk or wonder if he was qualified. He simply climbed the fire escape because a person was in pain and he was the only one close enough to help. He talked her down the way his notebooks had taught him people were talked down, softly, patiently, refusing to let the silence win. When she finally stepped back from the edge and collapsed into him, sobbing, gripping his sleeve like it was the only solid thing left in the world, something in Izuku's chest cracked open like a seed splitting to let out its first root. He felt it before he understood it. Heat, not violent, not painful, a slow golden warmth that spread from his sternum down both arms and pooled at the points where her hands held on to him. Himiko gasped and pulled back, staring at her own fingers as if they had caught fire, except there were no flames. There was only a faint shimmer under her skin, like moonlight trapped in glass. Izuku did not know what he had done. He only knew that the crushing, hopeless weight he'd felt in her, the specific despair of a person who believed she would never be enough, had loosened. Not vanished. Loosened, like a fist finally allowed to unclench. It took 3 days for the quirk to fully surface. 3 days of Himiko flinching at strange sensations under her skin, of small unexplainable events, a doorknob turning without her touching it, a hallway light flickering into brightness the instant she wished it would. On the 4th day, in the empty lot behind her apartment building, she reached out with her mind, more out of desperate curiosity than intention, and matter obeyed her. She could rearrange the molecular bonds of non-living material with a thought. Concrete flowed like water under her mental command and then set hard as diamond. She built a wall 12 feet high out of loose gravel in under a minute, tears streaming down her face the entire time, because for the first time since she was old enough to understand the word quirkless, she was not less than anyone. She went looking for Izuku that same night. It did not take long. There were only so many boys in the district who matched the description she gave, quiet, green-haired, always carrying a battered notebook. When she found him outside a convenience store, she did not ask him what he had done to her. She asked him to do it again, for someone else, because she knew exactly what kind of person deserved it. That was how it started. Not with ambition, not with a plan to build anything, but with one girl who had been failed by a world obsessed with power, standing in front of a boy who had been failed by that same world, both of them slowly beginning to understand that Izuku Midoriya had been given the opposite of nothing. He had been given the ability to hand someone everything. Chapter 2. His mother found out before Yue did, which was probably the only reason Izuku survived those first chaotic weeks with his sanity intact. Inko Midoriya had spent 15 years bracing for her son to be hurt by a world that had already decided he did not matter. She had not braced for this. When Izuku sat her down at their kitchen table and, hands shaking, explained what had happened on that rooftop and in the days since, she did not scream and she did not celebrate. She went very quiet, the particular quiet of a mother recalculating every fear she had ever allowed herself to set aside. You gave her a quirk, she said. Permanently. From nothing. Izuku nodded, unable to look up from the table. And it only works if you actually care about the person. If it's real. That part he had worked out through trial. He'd attempted it once, carefully, on a stray cat that had wandered near their building, simple curiosity, not malice, and nothing at all had happened. No warmth, no shimmer, no reaching golden thread between his skin and its fur. He had tried it on a stranger on the train, a brief accidental brush of hands, and again nothing. It was only with Himiko, only in that terrified, sincere connection on the rooftop, that anything had moved between them at all. His mother reached across the table and took his hand, and for a moment Izuku held his breath, half expecting the golden warmth to answer even now, an involuntary echo of a bond that had existed his entire life. It did not come. Whatever the quirk required, it was not blood, not habit, not even love in its most familiar shape. It required something rarer, something given freely in a single unguarded moment, and Izuku did not yet have words for what that something was. They agreed, that night, on 3 rules, and those 3 rules would outlive every argument, every crisis, and every miracle that came after. First, Izuku would never use the quirk on anyone who had not asked for it, clearly, with their full understanding of what it meant. Second, he would never use it as a bargain, never dangling salvation in exchange for anything. Third, whatever he built with this power, it would exist to lift people up, not to keep them. Inko made him say the rules out loud 3 times before she let him go to bed. She was not naive enough to think a 15-year-old boy with the power to remake anyone into a god would go untested by the world's greed. She simply wanted to be certain that when the test came, her son would already know exactly who he intended to be. Yue found out 2 months later, in the middle of a routine sparring exercise, when a first-year named Itsuka Kendo suffered a training injury that partially severed the nerves in her dominant arm. It was not supposed to be dangerous. It was supposed to be a controlled evaluation, the kind Yue ran every year without incident, and yet somehow the safety measures failed at exactly the wrong angle at exactly the wrong moment. Recovery Girl's quirk had limits. Nerve damage of that severity, left too long, risked permanent loss of function even after healing, and permanent loss of function meant the end of a hero career before it had truly begun. Kendo had cried in the recovery room, not from the pain, but from the quiet devastation of watching a dream get taken by inches. Izuku had visited her that evening as a classmate, nothing more, carrying notes from missed lectures because that was the kind of thing he always did. He had not planned anything. He had simply sat beside her bed and listened while she talked, furious and grieving in equal measure, about how unfair it was that one bad landing could undo years of work. Somewhere in that conversation, in the honesty of 2 people who trusted each other enough to be unguarded, Kendo had reached out and gripped his hand the way a person grips anything when they are trying not to fall apart, and the golden warmth had answered. She felt her arm change before she understood what was happening. Not the arm itself, but everything beneath the skin, muscle fiber rewriting itself, nerve pathways rebuilding along entirely new architecture. When the sensation faded, she flexed her fingers and felt no pain at all, and a strength in that hand that had never been there before, strength that had nothing to do with her original quirk. By the next morning, Itsuka Kendo could enlarge any part of her body to 10 times its original mass with total structural integrity, an evolution so far beyond her old quirk that Recovery Girl ran 4 separate scans convinced her equipment had malfunctioned. It had not malfunctioned. Izuku Midoriya had simply done, quietly and without asking permission from anyone, exactly what he had promised his mother he would only do for the right reasons. Principal Nizu called him into the faculty office that same afternoon, and Izuku walked the long hallway certain he was about to be expelled. Chapter 3. Nizu did not expel him. Nizu, whose entire existence was built on the study of exactly the kind of anomaly Izuku represented, spent nearly 2 hours asking careful, precise questions instead, and at the end of it folded his small paws together and said something Izuku would remember for the rest of his life. You have been given the single most dangerous quirk in recorded history, Nizu said, and the fact that you are afraid of that is the only reason I am willing to let you keep it a secret a little while longer. The secrecy did not last, of course. Secrets involving the sudden, unexplained appearance of god-tier abilities in ordinary people rarely survived contact with a world as starved for wonder and as hungry for exploitable power as this one. Kendo's transformation made waves within UA first, and then, inevitably, beyond it. It was Himiko who suggested, gently and without any hidden agenda, that they stop trying to hide it and start trying to control how the truth came out instead. She had grown into her new abilities with a quiet, steady confidence that surprised everyone who remembered the girl who had once stood on a rooftop ledge, and she had appointed herself, without ever discussing it with Izuku directly, as something between his advisor and his shield. "They call you quirkless," she told him one evening, sitting on the steps outside his apartment building with the kind of blunt honesty only she seemed willing to offer him. "They have called you that your entire life like it was a diagnosis. Let them see what you actually are before someone else decides that story for you." The decision to go public was made carefully, deliberately, with lawyers Nizu quietly arranged and a statement drafted over 11 drafts until every word was exact. Izuku did not announce a quirk that granted power. He announced a discovery, a rare mutation capable of restoring lost function and, in select cases, generating entirely new ability where none had existed, always through voluntary, consensual, deeply personal exchange, never through force, never through coercion. The Hero Commission's interest arrived within the hour. It arrived, predictably, dressed in the language of public safety and national interest, men in dark suits explaining in careful bureaucratic terms that a resource of this magnitude could not simply remain in the hands of a 15-year-old boy operating on his own judgment. Izuku had expected fear. He had expected accusations of danger, warnings about the kind of power that had once belonged to a man named All for One, a name that hung unspoken but unmistakable behind every one of the Commission's careful sentences. What he had not expected was the offer that came instead, a proposal so smooth it had clearly been prepared long before the meeting began. A registry. A facility. A schedule of applicants, vetted and approved, delivered to him for processing like items on a production line. In exchange, protection, funding, and the full backing of the Hero Commission behind whatever he built. Izuku said no before Nizu could even translate the legal language into something softer. He did not do it out of arrogance. He did it because somewhere in the Commission's carefully worded contract, buried in a clause about efficient allocation of resources, was language that would have stripped away the very thing his mother had made him promise on that first night. The requirement that every gift be given freely, chosen, understood, never assigned. A registry did not ask people what they needed. A registry decided for them. The Commission representative's expression did not change, but something in the room's temperature did. "You understand," the man said carefully, "that a quirk like yours cannot simply operate unsupervised in the private sector. There will be pressure. There will be interest from parties far less patient than this office." Izuku understood that better than the man realized. He had already begun receiving letters, dozens of them within the first week, some from grieving families of injured heroes, some from quirkless children who had read the announcement and cried themselves to sleep with something that might have been hope for the first time in their lives, and some, unmistakably, from people whose interest in unearthly power had nothing to do with healing anyone at all. He would need somewhere safe. Somewhere he could meet the people who genuinely needed him without exposing them, or himself, to everyone who saw his quirk as a weapon to be seized rather than a gift to be given. Nizu, watching all of this unfold with the patient calculation of someone who had already seen 6 moves ahead, offered the solution before Izuku even finished forming the question. There was a property, technically still under UA's administrative umbrella but functionally independent, an old training annex on the coast that had fallen out of use decades earlier after a quirk-related structural failure had made the main buildings unsafe for standard renovation. It had good bones, Nizu said, and an excellent view, and more importantly, defensible sightlines and a perimeter that could be secured without drawing unwanted attention. If Izuku wanted a place to build something of his own, this would do. Izuku had not planned to build an institution. He had planned, at most, to help the people who found their way to him one at a time, quietly, the way he had helped Himiko and Kendo. But standing on the cracked concrete of that abandoned annex a week later, looking out over gray water under a colorless sky, he understood, with the particular clarity that only comes once or twice in a life, that quiet and small were no longer options available to him. Word was already spreading. People were already coming. Chapter 4. The first to arrive after Kendo was not a stranger at all, but a name from every notebook Izuku had ever filled as a child. Mirko had been the number 5 hero for 3 years running before a villain fight in the Chugoku region left her with catastrophic damage to both legs, the very legs that had made her entire fighting style possible. Recovery Girl's quirk could knit bone and close wounds, but it could not undo the specific, cruel truth that certain kinds of nerve and muscle trauma simply did not come back the same, not fully, not ever. Rumi Usajiyama did not do grief quietly. She showed up at the annex on her own 2 crutches, having discharged herself from the hospital against every doctor's explicit recommendation, and she did not knock. She simply stood in the doorway of what would eventually become the annex's main hall and said, loudly enough that half the building could hear her, that she had heard some green-haired brat was handing out miracles and she wanted to know if that included getting her legs back or if it was all just rumor and wishful thinking. Izuku had been terrified of her before he ever met her, the way any devoted fan is terrified of meeting their hero and finding the real person smaller than the myth. Mirko, in person, exceeded the myth in every direction, louder, sharper, more furious, and beneath all of that fury, when Izuku sat with her privately and listened to her talk for nearly 3 hours about what it felt like to have your entire identity built around a body that no longer obeyed you, something rawer and more frightened than she would ever admit to a camera. He explained the rules to her exactly as he had explained them to everyone else. This was not a transaction. This was not a favor she would owe him. Whatever came from this, if anything came at all, would be hers completely, freely given, no strings, no registry, no debt. Mirko had laughed at that, a short, disbelieving bark of a laugh. Nothing in this world is free, kid, she told him. Everything costs something. You'll learn that eventually, probably the hard way, probably from someone a lot less polite than me. She let him try anyway. Whether it was desperation or trust or simple exhaustion with having nothing left to lose, she took his offered hand and held it the way Kendo had, the way Himiko had, honest and unguarded in a moment too raw for pretense, and the golden warmth answered exactly as it always did. What emerged from her transformation 3 days later defied every expectation either of them had. Her legs did not simply return to their old strength. They exceeded it, densifying into something between bone and diamond, capable of absorbing impacts that would have shattered her old body without slowing her down at all, paired with a regenerative capacity that meant even severe injury would heal within hours rather than months. She tested it in the annex's cracked training yard, sprinting, leaping, slamming her reinforced legs into a section of old concrete wall hard enough to crater it, and then she had turned to Izuku with an expression he had never once seen on her face in any interview footage. Not fury. Not fierce professional pride. Something closer to wonder, undefended and completely genuine. You actually did it, she said, quieter than he had ever heard her speak. You actually gave it back to me. Better than it was. She did not leave after that. Officially, she remained the number 5 hero, still bound by commission contracts and public duty, but unofficially, from that day forward, Rumi Usajiyama considered the annex hers to defend, and Izuku Midoriya hers to protect, in whatever manner a woman like her chose to express protection, which mostly meant loudly threatening anyone who so much as looked at the boy the wrong way. Others followed in the weeks after, each with their own story, each arriving with a wound that the ordinary machinery of the hero world had no answer for. A young woman named Setsuna Tokage, quirkless her entire life and bullied for it in ways that left more than physical scars, came through the annex gates on the recommendation of a girl she had met once, briefly, a first year at UA named Himiko who had told her there was a place now where quirkless did not have to mean less than. A retired hero named Rei, whose ice quirk had been slowly deteriorating for years from an old injury nobody outside her family knew about, arrived quietly, almost apologetically, as if she were embarrassed to need anything at all after a lifetime of being the one who provided. Izuku met each of them the same way he had met Himiko on that rooftop, without calculation, without an agenda, simply present and willing to listen for as long as it took for the truth of what they needed to surface. And each time the golden warmth answered, another person walked away from the annex carrying something they had never expected to hold in their whole lives. Not power for its own sake. Restoration. Possibility. The specific, quiet miracle of being told, by someone who meant it completely, that they were not broken, not lesser, not finished, and that whatever came next was theirs to decide. By the end of the second month, the abandoned training annex on the coast had a name, chosen not by Izuku but by the growing number of women who now called it home. They called it the Sanctum, and though none of them ever said it aloud in quite these words, all of them understood it as something closer to a temple than a training facility, built not around a god's demand for worship but around a boy who had simply refused to let anyone he loved stay broken. Chapter 5. The Sanctum grew faster than Izuku had ever imagined possible, and with growth came the first real signs of a world unwilling to leave a miracle unclaimed. It began with journalists, camped at the edges of the property with telephoto lenses, desperate for a single usable photograph of the boy who had apparently reinvented 5 careers and rewritten the definition of quirkless in under 3 months. Izuku ignored them as best he could, though Mirko had made it something of a personal hobby to stand at the perimeter fence and stare the more persistent ones into retreat. Then came the offers, quieter and far more dangerous than the journalists. Corporations wanting exclusive licensing rights to whatever process Izuku used, though no such process existed to license. Foreign governments making polite, carefully worded inquiries about diplomatic cooperation, a phrase that, translated honestly, meant they wanted their own soldiers and heroes reforged into something unbeatable. Wealthy private individuals, some more openly than others, hinting that money was no object if their injured child, their aging parent, their own declining body could be granted a place at the front of whatever list Izuku was keeping. He kept no list. That had been the 4th rule, unspoken until now but understood by everyone at the Sanctum, that Izuku would not be pressured into ranking whose suffering mattered more. He met people as they came to him, honestly, one conversation at a time, and if the golden warmth answered, it answered. If it did not, no amount of money or pressure would change that. This refusal to be bought made him enemies faster than it made him allies, and the most dangerous of those enemies did not announce themselves with lawyers or press releases. They announced themselves the way villains always had. In the old world Izuku had grown up idolizing from the safety of his notebooks, with violence dressed up as opportunity. The attack came on a gray afternoon in the Sanctum's 4th month, while Izuku was walking the coastal path with Rei, discussing quietly the slow return of feeling in her hands after weeks of gradual recovery from her quirk's deterioration. 3 figures came over the ridge without warning, moving with the coordinated precision of people who had planned this for a long time, and the leader, a broad-shouldered man with a quirk that let him weaponize his own shadow, made his intentions clear within the first 10 seconds. He wanted Izuku alive. He wanted him compliant. And he had been hired, he said with an unsettling calm, by someone patient enough to have watched the Sanctum from a distance for weeks. Someone who had decided that a resource this valuable should not remain in the hands of children and washed-up heroes. What the man had not accounted for was Rei, whose ice quirk, restored and strengthened beyond its original limits, could now freeze the very air itself into razor-edged barriers in seconds. Nor had he accounted for Mirko, who arrived from the annex at a dead sprint the instant the Sanctum's perimeter alarms triggered, closing the distance in under 4 seconds and putting one of his companions through the trunk of a coastal pine before the man had even finished his sentence. The fight that followed was short, brutal, and utterly one-sided, not because the attackers were weak, but because they had made the catastrophic assumption that the women surrounding Izuku Midoriya were decorative, grateful ornaments rather than the single most dangerous concentration of restored and elevated power currently operating outside the Hero Commission's direct control. By the time it ended, the broad-shouldered man lay unconscious in a cage of Rei's frozen air, and his 2 companions had fled rather than face Mirko's second pass. Izuku stood in the middle of it all, shaking, more from the fear of what had almost happened to the people he cared about than from any injury to himself. That night, gathered in the Sanctum's main hall with Himiko, Kendo, Mirko, Rei, and Setsuna all present, Izuku said the thing he had been afraid to say since the very first letter had arrived weeks earlier. This is going to keep happening. As long as I exist, as long as this power exists, there will be people who want to take it, take all of this and turn it into something it was never meant to be. It was Himiko who answered him first, calm in the particular way she had grown calm since that night on the rooftop, and utterly certain. Then we get stronger, she said. Not for conquest. Not for anyone else's ambition. For each other. You didn't build an army, Izuku. You built a family that happens to be able to level a mountain if it has to. Let the world be afraid of that, if it wants to be afraid of something. Mirko, uncharacteristically quiet until then, nodded once, sharp and certain. The kid's right. We're not hiding what we are anymore. We're not apologizing for it either. Izuku looked around the room at the women who had, each in their own way, chosen to stay, chosen him, not because he had given them power but because he had given them back the right to choose anything at all, and he understood, with a clarity that settled something restless in his chest, that whatever came next, he would not be facing it alone. The sanctum would need walls stronger than concrete. It would need eyes on every horizon. And somewhere out there, watching from a distance neither Izuku nor anyone in that room could yet see, the people who had sent 3 men to fail on a coastal ridge were already drawing up a second plan, one considerably less careless than the first. Act 2. Chapter 6. The man Rei had frozen into a cage of razor-edged air had a name, Katsuoban, and a criminal record that stretched back nearly a decade, mostly small-time enforcement work for people who preferred their business conducted somewhere the Hero Commission never bothered to look. He talked, eventually, once the sanctum's residents made it clear that cooperation was the only path back to anything resembling a normal life. He had been hired through 3 separate intermediaries, none of whom knew each other, a structure designed specifically so that no single arrest could trace back to whoever sat at the top. The fee had been extraordinary. The instructions had been simple. Retrieve the boy. Do not damage the asset. Everyone around him was expendable. Nizu, who arrived at the sanctum less than a day after the attack with 2 UA security officers and an expression Izuku had never seen on him before, listened to the interrogation recording twice before setting it down on the table with unusual care, as if it might shatter. This is not commission work, Nizu said finally. The commission is many things, some of them frustrating, some of them short-sighted, but they do not hire street enforcers to abduct minors. This has the shape of something older. Something private. He did not need to say the name for everyone in the room to think it. All for One had been gone for years, defeated, imprisoned in a facility built specifically to contain him, but the world he had built, the black markets, the brokers, the quiet network of people who had spent decades trading in stolen and weaponized quirks, had not vanished with him. It had only gone quieter, waiting for something worth resurfacing for. And Izuku Midoriya, a boy capable of manufacturing god-tier ability out of nothing but touch and trust, was exactly the kind of prize that network had been built to chase. Nizu's recommendation was blunt. The sanctum needed real security, not just the goodwill and ferocity of the women who had chosen to stay there, but infrastructure, detection systems, a perimeter that could see trouble coming from further away than a coastal ridge. He offered UA resources quietly, off the books, the kind of favor that would never appear in any official ledger, because he had his own reasons for wanting Izuku's project to survive. You are proving something I have believed for a long time, Nizu told him, before he left that evening. That strength does not have to be hoarded to be safe. That a person can be given everything and still choose, freely, to give something back. The commission built its entire structure around the fear that power shared is power lost. You are showing them they were wrong. That frightens people far more than any villain ever could. Izuku turned that thought over for a long time after Nizu left, sitting on the sanctum's cliffside steps as the sky faded from gray to the deep blue of early evening. Himiko found him there an hour later, wrapped in a blanket against the sea wind, and sat down beside him without asking permission, the way she had started doing months ago and never stopped. You're thinking too loud, she said. I can practically hear the gears grinding from here. He told her what Nizu had said, about power hoarded versus power shared, about the specific fear that seemed to be driving men to send mercenaries after a 15-year-old boy. Himiko listened the whole way through without interrupting, which was rare enough that Izuku knew she was taking it seriously. Then let them be afraid, she said finally. You didn't ask for any of this, Izuku. Not the quirk, not the letters, not the mercenaries. But you didn't run from any of it either. You built something. A place. A family. If that scares the people who only understand power as a thing you take from someone else, that's not a flaw in what you built. That's proof it's working. It was, Izuku would later think, the first time anyone had described the sanctum as something with a purpose beyond his own guilt and good intentions. Not a shelter he had stumbled into building by accident, but a structure, deliberate and worth defending, standing in direct opposition to everything the old world of stolen power represented. He decided, that night, that the sanctum would grow. Not recklessly, not without care, but deliberately, because a family with 3 members was vulnerable in a way a family with 30 might not be, and because for every letter that arrived from someone dangerous, a dozen more arrived from people who were simply broken and afraid and had nowhere else left to turn. Chapter 7. Her name was Nijire Hado, and she came to the sanctum not because she was injured, but because she had spent 3 years watching her own quirk slowly consume the very brain it was supposed to empower. Wave motion had always been a demanding ability, the kind of quirk that borrowed from its user as much as it gave, and by her 2nd year as a licensed hero, doctors had quietly begun warning her that the neurological strain of repeated activation was accelerating far faster than anyone had predicted. She had another 5 years before the damage became irreversible, they told her. Maybe less if she kept working at the pace she always had. She arrived at the sanctum on a bright, ordinary afternoon, cheerful in the specific, slightly overwhelming way Izuku remembered from old broadcast interviews, immediately curious about everything, the architecture of the main hall, the ocean view, the particular scientific mechanism behind Izuku's own ability, which she peppered him with questions about before they had even finished introducing themselves properly. Kendo, who had grown into something like the sanctum's de facto den mother in the months since her own transformation, took an immediate liking to her, and within an hour the two of them were deep in a conversation about Hero Academy gossip that made Izuku feel, not for the first time, pleasantly irrelevant to his own building. When it came time to discuss why she had actually come, Nijire was disarmingly direct about it. "I don't want you to fix me," she told Izuku, sitting cross-legged on the floor of what had become an informal meeting room. "I want you to give me something that won't kill me by the time I'm 30. I've spent my whole career loving this quirk and hating what it's doing to me at the same time, and I'm tired of choosing between the two." It was, Izuku realized, a different kind of request than any he had received before. Himiko and Setsuna had needed a quirk where there had been none. Kendo and Mirko had needed restoration, a return to strength that injury had stolen. Nijire needed something else entirely, an evolution that preserved everything she loved about who she already was while removing the poison hidden inside it. He was honest with her about his uncertainty. "I don't know if I can do that specifically," he admitted. "I don't fully understand the rules of this thing even now. It seems to respond to what a person actually needs, not just what they ask for, but I can't promise you what comes out the other side will be exactly what you're picturing." Nijire had grinned at that, an expression far more serious underneath its brightness than it first appeared. "Good," she said. "I don't actually want a copy of what I already have. I want to find out what I'm capable of when nothing's trying to kill me from the inside anymore." The bond formed quickly, easily, in the specific way Izuku was coming to recognize as the truest kind, built not on desperation but on an honest, mutual trust that had nothing performative in it at all. When the golden warmth passed between them, it felt different this time, less like a flood and more like a careful, deliberate rewriting, as though the quirk itself understood it was not filling an emptiness but repairing an architecture that had simply been built wrong from the start. 3 days later, in the sanctum's training yard, Nijire discovered she could still generate the same devastating waveform bursts that had made her one of UA's most promising graduates, except now the neurological cost had simply vanished, replaced by something closer to a battery that recharged itself the more she used it rather than one that slowly burned out with every activation. She had cried when she realized it, not from pain but from the sudden, overwhelming absence of a fear she had carried so long she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be without it. "I get to keep being me," she told Izuku afterward, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand and laughing at herself for it. "That's the part nobody talks about, isn't it? Everyone thinks this is about becoming something new. Sometimes it's just about being allowed to keep being who you already were." News of her transformation spread through hero circles faster than any of the previous cases had, in part because Nijire, unlike the others, remained an active, licensed hero, competing officially in the field under her original registration even as her abilities quietly, dramatically improved. It became increasingly difficult for the Commission to dismiss what was happening at the Sanctum as an isolated curiosity when one of their own working heroes was visibly, undeniably thriving because of it. The Commission's public position hardened in response, cautious statements about unregulated quirk alteration and the importance of oversight, while privately, according to a source Nizu quietly cultivated inside the organization, a growing faction within the Commission had begun arguing that the smarter play was cooperation rather than confrontation. Not everyone in that building wanted Izuku controlled. Some of them, quietly, wanted him protected, understanding correctly that whatever he was building represented something the Commission's own rigid hierarchy had never been able to offer the people it was supposed to serve. Chapter 8. The broker's name, when Nizu's contact finally surfaced it 3 weeks later, was Genzo Ishikawa, a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades as a quiet fixture in the black markets that had grown up in the shadow of All for One's old network, dealing not in stolen quirks directly but in the infrastructure around them, safe houses, forged paperwork, private buyers with more money than conscience. He had never operated at this scale before. Katsuo Ban's failed abduction attempt had been, by all evidence, a test, cheap and disposable, meant to gauge the Sanctum's defenses before Ishikawa committed anything more valuable. The fact that it had failed so completely, and so publicly, had apparently done nothing to discourage him. If anything, the intelligence report Nizu shared suggested Ishikawa had simply concluded that greater resources were required, and had begun quietly acquiring them. That conclusion arrived at the Sanctum's gates in the form of 6 armed operatives and a single quirk user powerful enough to have warranted his own commission profile years earlier, before he vanished from official records entirely following a corruption scandal that had quietly ended his hero license. His name had once been Takashi Amamiya, hero name Judgment, and his quirk allowed him to project bursts of concussive force from any point of contact on his body, a devastating ability that had made him a rising star before greed and a taste for excessive force during arrests had ended his career in disgrace. He had spent the years since selling that same devastating ability to whoever paid the most, and Ishikawa, it seemed, had paid enormously. The attack came at dawn, deliberately timed to catch the Sanctum's residents at their least alert, and it very nearly worked. Amamiya's opening assault collapsed a full section of the annex's eastern wall before anyone had fully registered what was happening, the concussive force rolling through concrete and steel alike as though they were paper. It was Mirko who reached him first, moving faster than any camera at any of her old commission fights had ever managed to capture, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she found herself genuinely matched. Amamiya's force projection could meet her reinforced strikes head-on without breaking, each collision between them sending shockwaves rippling out across the training yard hard enough to shatter every window in the annex's remaining structure. Rei answered next, laying down sheets of razor-edged ice to funnel Ishikawa's remaining operatives into narrow, defensible corridors where their numbers meant nothing against her control of the terrain. Kendo, massive and immovable, planted herself at the Sanctum's main entrance and simply refused to move, absorbing blows that would have leveled an ordinary person without so much as stumbling. Nijire's wave motion, freed now from the cost that had once made her ration every use of it, tore through 3 of the operatives in a single sustained burst that left them unconscious before they had fired a single shot. Himiko, whose molecular control over non-living matter had grown terrifyingly precise in the months since her rooftop transformation, collapsed the ground itself beneath 2 more attackers, swallowing them into a hardened stone cage before they understood what was happening. Izuku, forbidden by every single person in the Sanctum from joining the fight directly, watched from the annex's reinforced observation room with his hands pressed flat against the window, aching with the specific, helpless fury of a person forced to witness danger to people he loved without being able to do anything physical about it. He was not, however, entirely without purpose. Through the annex's internal comm system, hastily installed after the first attack, he fed real-time information to everyone on the field, watching angles no single fighter could track alone, calling out openings, warning of incoming strikes half a second before they landed. The same analytical instinct that had once filled 1,000 pages of hero notebooks now turned into the thing that kept his family alive. The battle turned decisively when Mirko, exploiting a half-second opening Izuku had spotted and called out over the comm, finally broke through Amamiya's guard entirely, driving one reinforced kick through his projected force field hard enough to end the fight in a single devastating blow. He did not get back up. By the time it was over, all 6 operatives and Amamiya himself lay defeated across a training yard scarred with frost, cratered stone, and the wreckage of a wall that would need weeks to rebuild. Not one Sanctum resident had suffered anything worse than bruising. It was, by any measure, an overwhelming, decisive victory. And yet, standing in the wreckage afterward, watching Mirko wince through the beginning of her own rapid healing and Rei carefully checking each of the unconscious operatives for injuries she could not in good conscience ignore even in enemies, Izuku felt none of the relief he had expected. They will keep sending people, he said quietly, to no one in particular. And each time, they'll send someone stronger, because we keep proving the last plan wasn't enough. Chapter 9. The interrogation of Ishikawa's captured operatives yielded a name that made Nizu go very still for the second time in as many months. Ishikawa, it turned out, was not operating independently at all. He answered, through channels layered even more carefully than the ones protecting his own identity, to someone the operatives only ever referred to as the curator, a figure none of them had ever met in person, who communicated exclusively through intermediaries and paid in amounts that made questions about identity feel deeply unwise. The curator's interest in Izuku, according to fragments the operatives were willing to share, was not simple greed. It was something closer to obsession, a belief, apparently held with mere religious conviction, that the old dream of a single unified power, the dream All for One had pursued for decades before his defeat, could be resurrected and perfected through Izuku's ability rather than through the crude theft and hoarding that had defined the old villain's methods. Where All for One had stolen Quirks by force, stripping them from unwilling victims and stacking them inside himself like plundered treasure, the curator apparently believed Izuku's gift represented something more elegant, more sustainable. A single individual, properly controlled, capable of manufacturing an army of loyal, devoted, god-tier operatives, each of them bound to their creator not through theft but through gratitude, through the specific, powerful loyalty that came from believing someone had given you everything you had. It was, Nizu observed grimly, an almost correct read of what the sanctum had already become, twisted just enough to turn devotion into servitude and family into a weapon aimed outward at the world. The thought sat badly with everyone who heard it, and it sat worst of all with Izuku himself, who spent that night unable to sleep, staring at the cracked ceiling of his room in the rebuilt annex and turning the curator's supposed philosophy over and over, hunting for the exact point where it diverged from what he actually believed he was doing. Himiko found him still awake near dawn, sitting on the cliffside steps again, the way he always seemed to end up there whenever the weight of things became too large for 4 walls to hold. She did not ask what was wrong. She had learned, over the months since that rooftop, that Izuku talked easier when he was not being directly asked to. He's not entirely wrong about what this could become, Izuku admitted eventually, watching the first gray light spread across the water. If I ever let it. If I ever started thinking of you all as mine instead of as people who chose to be here. That's the whole difference, isn't it? Between what I'm trying to build and what he wants to twist it into. Whether the people around me are here because they chose it, or because I decided they belong to me. Himiko was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice held none of its usual sharp humor, only a steady, considered honesty that had grown into her over the past year the way strength had grown into her hands. Then don't let that be the difference that slips, she said. Ask us. Keep asking us. Every single day if you have to. The moment you stop wondering whether we'd choose this again, that's the moment you start becoming exactly what he's afraid of and hoping for at the same time. It was, Izuku thought, exactly the kind of clarity he needed and had been too tired to find on his own. He made a decision that morning, quiet but absolute, that would define everything the sanctum became from that point forward. No one who came to him would ever again be assumed to be staying. Every single month, he would ask, individually, privately, whether the people who called the sanctum home still wanted to be there, still felt the golden warmth between them as a gift rather than an obligation. It seemed like a small thing, a simple recurring conversation, but it would become, in later years, one of the defining structures of what outsiders eventually began calling the sanctum's accord, the quiet, deliberate practice of consent renewed rather than assumed, the single clearest line separating what Izuku had built from everything the curator hoped to twist it into. For now, though, it was simply a promise made on a cliffside at dawn, between a boy who had once believed himself worth less than nothing and a girl who had once stood on the edge of a different rooftop entirely, both of them equally certain that whatever the curator was planning next, it would not find the sanctum unprepared, and it would not find the family inside it anything less than a choice, freely and repeatedly made. Chapter 10. The girl's name was Yui Kodai, and she arrived at the sanctum 3 weeks after the battle with Ishikawa's operatives, walking the last 2 kilometers on foot because she had spent the last of her money on the train ticket and had nothing left over for a taxi from the nearest station. She was quirkless, 17, and had spent the last year of her life in a support course at a third-tier hero academy, building costumes and equipment for classmates who barely acknowledged her existence, absorbing the particular, grinding loneliness of being present in a world built entirely around power she did not have. She had read about the sanctum in a fragment of an article that had slipped past the more careful gatekeeping the commission had started applying to press coverage, and she had made the decision to come without telling anyone, because she was certain, with the specific certainty of someone who had been disappointed too many times before, that if she asked anyone's permission they would talk her out of it. Kendo found her collapsed against the annex's outer fence, exhausted and dehydrated, and carried her inside without hesitation, the way she had carried herself in the months since her own transformation, protective in a manner that had nothing performative about it at all. Izuku sat with her for 2 full days before either of them spoke about why she had come, not because he was avoiding the conversation but because Yui herself needed that time, quiet, fed, safe, before she could bring herself to say out loud the thing she had walked 2 kilometers to ask. I don't want to be a hero, she told him finally, on the second evening, sitting wrapped in a blanket in the same spot on the cliffside steps that had become an informal council chamber for half the sanctum's residents by now. I never wanted that. I just wanted to stop being invisible. I wanted, just once, to walk into a room and have someone look at me like I mattered before they found out what I could or couldn't do. It was a different kind of wound than any Izuku had encountered so far, not the specific grief of a hero stripped of ability, not the sharp fury of a girl who had been actively bullied for her lack of a quirk, but something quieter and in some ways more corrosive, the slow accumulation of simply never being seen at all. He did not promise her power. He had learned, by now, that promises were the wrong shape for what this quirk actually offered. He simply listened, the way he had listened on a rooftop over a year earlier, without an agenda, without calculation, present in the specific, total way that had become the truest expression of who Izuku Midoriya actually was underneath all the responsibility that had been thrust onto him since. The golden warmth answered on the 3rd day, quietly, without spectacle, while Yui was describing, through tears she seemed almost angry at herself for shedding, the exact moment she had decided support work was the closest she would ever get to belonging in the hero world. Izuku had reached out, not with any plan, simply because she looked like she needed a hand to hold, and the bond had formed the way it always did, honest and unguarded and entirely mutual. What emerged from Yui Kodai over the following days was unlike anything the sanctum had produced before. She did not manifest offensive power or defensive resilience at all. Instead, she found herself capable of perceiving and subtly amplifying the emotional and physical state of everyone within a significant radius, not mind-reading, nothing so invasive, but something closer to an instinctive understanding of exactly what a person needed in a given moment, paired with a limited ability to project calm, focus, or courage into those around her when they needed it most. It was, Kendo observed the first time she watched Yui in action, steadying an entire training exercise through nothing more than a quiet, focused presence at its center, the single most valuable ability anyone had manifested at the sanctum yet, precisely because it asked for nothing in return except the chance to finally be needed. Yui cried again when she understood what she had become, though this time the tears carried none of the old bitterness. I get to make sure no one else here ever feels like I did, she said. And for the first time since she had walked through the sanctum's gates, she smiled without any of the guardedness that had defined her since she arrived. The sanctum had, by the end of its 6th month, grown to 8 residents, each of them transformed not merely in ability but in the fundamental architecture of how they understood their own worth, and each of them increasingly aware that the growing family they had become was drawing exactly the kind of attention the curator had been patiently, methodically building toward from the very beginning. Chapter 11. The curator's 3rd move came not as an attack but as an invitation, delivered through a channel so carefully constructed that Nizu's contacts inside the commission took nearly a week to confirm it was genuine and not an elaborate trap designed to waste the sanctum's resources chasing a false lead. The invitation was simple, almost insultingly so. A private meeting, neutral ground, a decommissioned hero training facility on the outskirts of the city, no weapons, no entourage, just Izuku and whoever he trusted enough to bring as a single witness. The curator wished, the message claimed, to speak with him directly, to make an offer that violence had so far failed to secure through simpler means. Every instinct in the sanctum screamed against it. Mirko wanted to burn the message and forget it had ever arrived. Rei argued, with the calm precision that had made her a legendary hero in her prime, that walking into a location chosen entirely by an enemy was the single worst tactical decision available to them. Himiko said nothing for a long time, watching Izuku's face carefully, and it was her silence, more than anyone else's argument, that made him pause and actually consider it. In the end, Izuku decided to go, not out of recklessness, but because he had begun to understand something about the curator's philosophy that troubled him more than any direct attack could. A man who believed power should be manufactured through gratitude and loyalty rather than stolen through force was, in his own twisted way, trying to make an argument, and arguments could sometimes be undone more thoroughly by being answered than by being avoided entirely. He brought Himiko as his witness, over Mirko's loud, extensive objections, because Himiko alone among the sanctum's residents had walked the furthest distance from where she started, quirkless and hopeless to reshaping stone with a thought, and Izuku wanted the curator, whoever he turned out to be, to look directly at the proof that his entire philosophy was built on a foundation that did not actually require anyone to be owned. The decommissioned facility was exactly as isolated and unsettling as its description had promised, an old training hall stripped of equipment, dust thick on every surface, lit only by the gray daylight filtering through high, grimy windows. The curator was waiting for them when they arrived, and the reveal, when it came, managed to be both anticlimactic and deeply unsettling at once. He was an old man, unremarkable in appearance, dressed in a plain gray suit that could have belonged to any retired bureaucrat, and he introduced himself, without any theatrical flourish, as Dr. Kenji Oki, a name that meant nothing to either of them until he explained, calmly and without any apparent shame, that he had once served as a junior researcher on a government Quirk study decades earlier, one of the last surviving members of a project that had, quietly and unofficially, studied all for one's captured research in the years following his imprisonment. I do not want what he wanted, Oki said, settling into an old folding chair with the careful movements of a man well into his 70s. All for One wanted to be a god standing alone at the top of a pyramid of stolen strength. I find that vision crude. Wasteful. What you have built, Izuku Midoriya, is so much more elegant. An empire that does not require force at all, only devotion, freely given, endlessly renewable. I simply wish to see it perfected, expanded, applied at a scale worthy of what it actually is. Izuku listened to the entire proposal without interrupting, an offer of resources, protection, expansion beyond anything the sanctum could achieve alone, in exchange for nothing more, Oki insisted, than access, oversight, a hand quietly guiding decisions about who received the gift and in what order, decisions Oki framed as simple efficiency but which Izuku recognized, immediately and completely, as the exact registry he had refused the hero commission at the very beginning. You want me to decide who deserves this and who doesn't, Izuku said finally, and you want to be the one standing behind me telling me the answer. That's not efficiency. That's exactly what you claim to find crude about the man you're trying not to become. Oki's expression did not change, but something in his posture did, a subtle recalibration that Izuku recognized, with a chill, as the moment a negotiation ended and a different kind of calculation began. Himiko had gone very still beside him, every ounce of her attention narrowed to the old man's hands, watching for the first sign of movement toward whatever weapon or quirk he had kept hidden this entire conversation. You misunderstand me, boy, Oki said quietly. I am not asking. I have simply been patient enough to offer you the version of this where you keep your family intact and your hands relatively clean. The version where you refuse costs considerably more, for everyone you have gathered around yourself, and I suspect, given what I have read about your character, that cost is the one thing you have never been willing to let someone else pay. Chapter 12. The exit from the facility was tense but uneventful, Oki making no move to stop them as Izuku and Himiko walked back out into the gray afternoon, and it was precisely that lack of resistance that left both of them more unsettled than any direct confrontation would have. He wasn't bluffing, Himiko said once they were clear of the building, her voice tight in a way Izuku rarely heard from her anymore. Men like that don't threaten unless the threat is already loaded and pointed at something specific. She was right, though it took another 2 days for the shape of that threat to become clear. It arrived not at the sanctum's gates but at Izuku Midoriya's apartment, in the form of a single, carefully worded letter slipped beneath the door sometime in the night, containing no explicit threat that any court could act on, only a photograph of the building's entrance, time-stamped, and a single line of text observing how remarkably unguarded ordinary residential buildings tended to be, compared to the growing fortress on the coast. Izuku's reaction to that letter was the closest anyone at the sanctum had ever seen him come to losing the careful, deliberate calm he had built for himself over the past year. He wanted to move his mother immediately, that same night, and it was Rei, of all people, who talked him into a slower, more considered response, arguing from hard-won experience that panicked relocation often created more vulnerabilities than it closed. They moved Izuku within the week regardless, quietly, to a secured wing of the sanctum itself that Niza helped fortify with the same defensive infrastructure protecting the rest of the compound, and if Izuku had any hesitation about leaving the small apartment she had raised her son in alone for 17 years, she did not voice it, understanding without needing to be told exactly what kind of danger her son had walked directly into during that meeting. The message Oki had sent, wrapped in the polite fiction of an observation rather than a threat, achieved exactly what it was designed to achieve. It made the danger personal, immediate, no longer an abstract enemy operating through hired mercenaries at a distance but a man who had demonstrated, cleanly and without a single overt act of violence, that he could reach anyone Izuku loved whenever he chose to. It was Nijire, in the tense council that followed, who articulated the shift in strategy that the sanctum would need going forward. "He's not going to send another Amamiya," she said, unusually serious. "He already showed his hand with that letter. He wants us paralyzed, second-guessing every shadow, spending all our energy on defense instead of growth. That's the actual weapon here. Not violence. Fear dressed up as patience." It was Yui, quiet even now among the sanctum's louder, more established voices, who offered the counter to that fear, her newly discovered ability to read the emotional undercurrents of a room letting her speak with an unusual, grounded clarity. "Then we don't let him have that either," she said. "We keep growing. We keep choosing this, every one of us, out loud, where he can see it. Let him watch a family get stronger instead of a fortress getting more afraid." Izuku carried that conversation with him for days afterward, turning it over the way he turned over everything, methodically, exhaustively, searching for the flaw in it the way he had once searched for the flaw in every hero's fighting style in his old notebooks. He found none. Yui was right, and so was Nijire, and the only path forward that did not hand Oki exactly the paralysis he wanted was the one that refused to be paralyzed at all. So the sanctum grew. Word continued to spread, carefully managed now through channels Niza helped construct, of a place where the broken and the overlooked could come and be met not with a transaction but with an honest, searching kind of care that asked nothing except whether the person in front of Izuku actually wanted what he could offer. More letters arrived. More quiet, careful visits followed, though every single one was now vetted through security measures that would have been unthinkable a year earlier, back when Izuku had simply climbed a fire escape because a girl was crying and he had not thought to calculate the risk at all. That innocence, Izuku understood now, standing on the rebuilt cliffside steps with his mother safely settled inside the walls behind him and 7 transformed women who had chosen, again and again, to call this fractured, dangerous, extraordinary place home, was gone for good. In its place had grown something else entirely, deliberate rather than accidental, defended rather than merely lucky, and every bit as certain of what it stood for as Dr. Kenji Oki was certain of what he intended to take from it. Somewhere beyond the sanctum's fortified walls, in an office no one at the compound had yet located, Oki was already drawing up his next approach, patient in the specific, terrible way of a man who had waited decades already and considered a few more months an entirely acceptable price for the empire he still believed he could build out of another man's family. Chapter 13. Mei Hatsum arrived at the sanctum the way she arrived everywhere, in the middle of an explanation nobody had asked for, wheeling a cart of half-finished support equipment through the front gate before anyone had even confirmed her identity at the checkpoint. She was not injured. She was not quirkless. Her quirk, the ability to instinctively understand and improve mechanical systems on site, worked exactly as it always had, and by any reasonable measure she had no need of anything Izuku's ability could offer her. She had come, she explained with the particular manic enthusiasm that had made her both beloved and exhausting throughout her time at UA, because she had heard about the defensive failures during the Amamiya attack and found the entire situation professionally offensive. You're running a compound full of people who can bench press a building and your perimeter detection is still basically a fence and some hope, she told Izuku within the first 5 minutes of arriving, already unpacking a case of prototype sensors onto the nearest available table. That's not a security system, that's an invitation. Izuku had not asked her to come, and technically speaking she was not, in the traditional sense, one of the sanctum's transformed residents at all. But within 2 weeks she had made herself so thoroughly indispensable, rewiring the NX's entire detection grid, designing early warning systems keyed to detect quirk signatures before they crossed the outer perimeter, retrofitting Rei's ice constructs with structural reinforcements that made them nearly twice as durable, that nobody at the sanctum seriously questioned whether she belonged there anymore. She did, eventually, ask Izuku for something, though it took her considerably longer to work up to the request than it had taken anyone else who had come before her. Not a new ability, she clarified quickly, when Izuku raised the obvious assumption. I like my quirk exactly the way it is. I just want to know if what you do can work on machines instead of people. If that golden thing of yours could bond with hardware the same way it bonds with a person. It was a question nobody had thought to ask before, and Izuku spent several days testing it carefully, cautiously, uncertain whether the specific intimacy his ability required could even translate to something without a mind or a will of its own to meet him halfway. The answer, when it finally came, surprised both of them. The bond required a person's intention behind it, a genuine, sincere act of care, but it did not require the recipient of that care to be alive at all. Working together, hour after hour in the NX's newly rebuilt workshop, Izuku and Mei discovered that his ability could infuse specially designed equipment with a kind of adaptive, almost living responsiveness, machinery that could learn and adjust to its users' needs in ways no ordinary engineering could replicate. It was not a quirk in any traditional sense, more a permanent enhancement layered directly into the hardware itself, but the implications, both of them understood immediately, were enormous. Rei's ice constructs, once passed through the process, began holding their shape days longer than physics alone should have allowed. Kendo's training equipment adapted itself automatically to the specific demands of her enlarging quirk. Mei herself, working with a prototype support suit she had spent months designing before ever arriving at the sanctum, found the completed equipment responding to her intentions with an intuitive precision that made every previous version of her work look primitive by comparison. This changes everything, Mei said one evening, staring at the modified suit with the specific, quiet awe she usually reserved for moments right before she did something reckless. You're not just giving people power anymore. You're giving the whole world a new kind of tool. Do you understand how many people you could help who don't even need a new quirk, just better equipment that actually works with them instead of against them? Izuku understood, and the understanding settled into him with the particular weight of a door opening onto a room far larger than he had realized the house contained. The sanctum, until now, had been built entirely around the specific, intimate gift of granting ability to people who lacked it or had lost it. Mei's discovery suggested something broader, a version of his ability that could ripple outward into the wider hero world without requiring every single recipient to undergo the same profound personal transformation the sanctum's residents had. It also, Nizu observed carefully when he learned of the breakthrough, created an entirely new category of asset for the curator to covet, and an entirely new category of vulnerability if that asset ever fell into the wrong hands. A machine bonded through Izuku's ability could, in theory, be studied, reverse-engineered, perhaps even weaponized in ways a living, willing person never could be. The sanctum would need to guard this discovery as carefully as it guarded Izuku himself. Chapter 14. The first sign that something inside the sanctum's own walls had gone wrong came not from an attack but from a discrepancy, small and easily overlooked, in the compound's newly installed detection logs. May found it during a routine system check, a gap of exactly 4 minutes in the perimeter sensor records from 3 nights earlier, too brief and too precisely erased to be a malfunction. Someone had accessed the system deliberately, disabled it for the specific window needed to move unseen across a section of the eastern grounds, and then carefully restored it before anyone would have thought to look. The list of people with both the access credentials and the technical knowledge to accomplish something that clean was mercifully short, which made the answer, once May and Nizu cross-referenced the compound staff logs, considerably more painful than a longer list would have been. It pointed to Daichi Furukawa, one of the 2 UA security officers Nizu had quietly assigned to the Sanctum's protection detail months earlier. Furukawa did not deny it when confronted, which somehow made the betrayal land harder than an argument would have. He simply looked exhausted, the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent weeks convincing himself that what he was doing was justified, and told them, without much resistance, that his younger sister had been diagnosed 8 months earlier with a degenerative condition that no hospital treatment had been able to slow, and that a representative claiming to work for Oki had approached him with a promise no doctor had ever been able to make. A cure, permanent and certain, in exchange for small, deniable favors. Disable a sensor for 4 minutes. Note the layout of a hallway. Nothing that ever felt, in the moment, like it was actually hurting anyone. It was Rei, unexpectedly, who argued against the harshest response the rest of the council initially favored. I understand desperation, she said quietly, and something in the specific way she said it made everyone remember, briefly, her own long, quiet decline before Izuku had found her. I understand exactly what a person will convince themselves is a small, harmless thing when the alternative is watching someone they love disappear in front of them. That doesn't make what he did acceptable. But it does mean the enemy here found the door he needed by exploiting a wound none of us thought to check for. Furukawa was removed from the sanctum immediately, handed over to UA's internal affairs for whatever legal consequences followed, but the incident forced a reckoning the compound had not yet had to face directly. Every single person inside those walls, staff and transformed residents alike, carried some wound, some fear, some desperate hope that a patient, sufficiently resourced enemy could locate and exploit given enough time and enough money. Izuku called a full council that evening, every resident present, and asked the question directly rather than letting it fester unspoken the way it clearly had inside Furukawa for months before it finally broke him. Is there anyone in this room who is afraid, right now, of something I don't know about? Anyone who thinks Oki might already know exactly which door to knock on? The silence that followed was not the silence of people with nothing to say. It was the silence of people working up the courage to say something difficult in front of a family they had only recently allowed themselves to trust completely. Setsuna broke at first, admitting quietly that her younger brother, still living in the same neighborhood where she had grown up quirkless and bullied, remained a point of vulnerability she had never fully addressed with anyone at the sanctum. Mirko admitted, more reluctantly than anyone expected from her, that her ongoing commission obligations meant she was rarely fully protected by the sanctum's own security during her official duty hours, a gap Oki's people could theoretically exploit whenever they chose. By the end of that long, difficult evening, the sanctum had a clearer, more honest map of its own vulnerabilities than it had ever possessed before, painful in the making but invaluable in what it allowed Nizu and May to actually defend. It was, Izuku thought afterward, watching his family disperse for the night considerably more tired but also considerably more unified than they had been that morning, exactly the kind of hard, unglamorous work that no amount of god-tier power could substitute for. Trust had to be built the same slow, deliberate way ability had been. Honestly, repeatedly, with nothing assumed and nothing hidden. Chapter 15. Oki's response to the failure of his infiltration attempt arrived nearly a month later, and it arrived in a form none of the sanctum's residents had anticipated, not violence, not another quiet threat slipped under a door, but a carefully orchestrated media campaign designed to turn public opinion against everything Izuku had built. It began with an anonymous source, quoted in a moderately credible news outlet, raising pointed questions about the true nature of the bond required for Izuku's ability to function. Was it truly consent, the article asked, When the person granting a life-altering gift held such enormous, unchecked influence over the person receiving it. Could any of the sanctum's residents, the piece suggested without ever stating outright, genuinely be said to have chosen their transformation freely, or had they simply been made grateful enough, dependent enough, that refusal had quietly become unthinkable? The article was, Izuku recognized immediately upon reading it, a nearly perfect inversion of the truth, taking the sanctum's actual practice of continuous, renewed consent and twisting it into evidence of manipulation instead. It was also, he had to admit with a sick, sinking feeling, exactly persuasive enough to work on an audience that had never seen the inside of the compound for themselves. Public reaction split almost immediately along predictable lines. Longtime critics of the Hero Commission's rigid power structures rallied behind the sanctum, arguing that an institution built on freely given ability represented exactly the kind of alternative the system desperately needed. More cautious voices, and there were considerably more of these than the sanctum's residents found comfortable, began calling for exactly the kind of government oversight Izuku had refused from the very beginning, this time with public sentiment providing the pressure the commission itself had never quite managed to generate on its own. Nijire, still officially operating as a licensed hero even as her fame at the sanctum grew, bore the brunt of the public scrutiny most directly, hounded by reporters demanding she prove, on camera, that her transformation had been entirely her own choice. She handled it with a directness that surprised even the people who knew her best, agreeing to a single, carefully controlled interview in which she described her own decision, her own reasoning, her own ongoing right to walk away from the sanctum at any time she chose, in terms specific and grounded enough that even several of the more skeptical outlets ran headlines considerably softer than their original framing. It helped, but it did not end the pressure, and Izuku understood, watching the story continue to churn through news cycles for the better part of 2 weeks, that Oki had found a weapon considerably more patient and more difficult to counter with force than any mercenary he had sent before. You cannot punch a narrative, Mirko observed with uncharacteristic frustration during one particularly tense council meeting. Believe me, I've tried it conceptually about 11 times this week alone. The eventual answer came, fittingly, from Yui, whose quiet ability to read the emotional undercurrents of a room had made her an unexpectedly sharp observer of the public mood as well. Stop trying to argue with the story from behind our walls, she suggested. Open the door. Let people actually see what this is, instead of letting Oki's version fill in every blank we leave empty. It was a considerable risk, and it took 2 full days of careful debate before the council agreed to it, but the eventual result was a single, tightly controlled, invited visit, a handful of carefully selected journalists and one respected, independent Quirk ethics researcher given full access to the sanctum for an entire day, free to speak privately with any resident who chose to talk to them, with no restrictions on what questions could be asked. The resulting coverage, when it finally ran, did more to shift public opinion than every prior statement, interview, or legal filing combined, largely because it did not attempt to argue anything at all. It simply showed Kendo laughing over a meal with the family that had once been strangers to her. It showed Rei's hands, steady now after years of decline, carefully bandaging Setsuna's brother's scraped knee during a visit home. It showed Izuku himself, unremarkable and quietly exhausted in exactly the way a boy his age carrying that much responsibility should look, answering every question, even the difficult ones, without flinching from a single one of them. Oki's narrative did not vanish entirely, and skepticism from certain corners of the public and the commission alike would linger for a long time afterward, but the momentum of his campaign broke against the simple, undeniable weight of people seeing the truth for themselves. It was, Nizu observed with something close to admiration when the news cycle finally began to cool, the first battle the sanctum had won without a single blow being thrown, and in some ways, he suspected, the most important one yet. Chapter 16. The calm that followed the media storm lasted just long enough for the sanctum to convince itself, cautiously, that it had won something lasting, and it was precisely that fragile optimism that made the night everything changed feel so much colder in contrast. It began with Yui, who woke in the small hours of the morning with a certainty she could not immediately explain, a rawness pressing against the edge of her newly discovered sense the way a held breath presses against a closed throat. She could feel it radiating from somewhere near the compound's northern boundary, not fear exactly, not pain, but a vast, patient stillness that had no business existing anywhere near a place full of sleeping people. She woke Kendo first, then Rei, moving through the annex's dim corridors with the specific urgency of someone who did not yet have proof but trusted the feeling anyway, and by the time the full council had gathered in the main hall, Mei's detection grid had already begun registering the thing Yui's senses had caught a full 2 minutes earlier. A Quirk signature at the northern fence line, massive, unfamiliar, and utterly unlike anything the system's database had on file. Oki had sent no mercenaries this time. He had sent, instead, a single figure, tall and unnaturally still even on the grainy security footage, standing just beyond the tree line with the patient posture of someone who had walked there on foot and intended to wait exactly as long as necessary. Nizu, roused from his own quarters and patched into the compound's internal feed within minutes, went silent for a long moment studying the image before speaking, and when he finally did, his voice carried none of its usual composure. "That is not one of Ishikawa's people," Nizu said. "That is not anyone on any registry I have access to." Whatever Oki found this time, he did not buy it on the open market. Izuku stood at the center of the gathered council, watching the same grainy footage, and felt something cold and certain settle into his chest, the specific dread of a person recognizing, without yet having proof, that the shape of the coming fight had just changed entirely. Mirko wanted to go out immediately, alone if necessary, and end whatever this was before it had the chance to become anything larger. It was Rei, calm even now, who convinced her to wait, arguing correctly that a figure willing to stand in plain view of their detection systems, unhurried and unhidden, was either supremely competent or deliberately baiting a response, and charging out to meet either possibility without a plan served no one. They watched instead, the entire sanctum gathered in the main hall through the long remainder of the night, as the figure simply stood at the tree line, unmoving, making no attempt to approach the compound at all. It was Mei who finally identified, through careful analysis of the sensor data, the detail that turned quiet unease into something closer to genuine alarm. The Quirk signature radiating from the figure was not singular. It was layered, dozens of distinct energy patterns overlapping within a single body, the unmistakable signature of stacked, stolen ability. "It's a for one user," Nijire said quietly, the realization landing across the room like a physical weight. "Not the original. Someone new. Someone Oki built exactly the way he said he wanted to build things, except this one wasn't given anything freely. This one was made the old way." Dawn arrived without the figure ever moving from its position, and when the pale morning light finally revealed enough detail for the compound's cameras to capture clearly, Izuku found himself staring at a face he did not recognize, young, unnervingly calm, watching the sanctum's walls with the patient, hungry attention of something that had been built for exactly this purpose and had never once been asked whether it wanted the job. A message arrived moments later, delivered through the same untraceable channel that had carried Oki's invitation weeks earlier, brief and almost gentle in its phrasing. "This is second chapter," the message read. "I built in the way your world once built its most feared weapon, except properly this time, without the mistakes that undid the first attempt. He does not need to eat, or sleep, or rest, and unlike you, Izuku Midoriya, he does not require consent from anyone to grow stronger. I am not attacking today. I am simply showing you what patience looks like when it stops waiting for permission." The council sat with that message for a long time after it arrived, the specific silence of people confronting, for the first time, an enemy built not from greed or opportunity but from a genuine, twisted counter-argument to everything the sanctum stood for. Izuku had built a family through freely given trust. Oki, it seemed, had finally decided to answer that with a weapon built entirely from its absence, assembled the old way, the cruel way, a demonstration that power taken by force could still be made to stand, unmoving and terrible, at the edge of everything Izuku had spent a year proving did not require force at all. Himiko found Izuku on the cliffside steps again as the sun finally cleared the horizon, the same spot that had become, over the past year, the place where the hardest truths of the sanctum always eventually settled. Neither of them spoke for a long time, watching the distant, unmoving figure at the tree line through the annex's reinforced windows, until Izuku finally broke the silence with the only question that mattered. "Whatever this is," he said quietly, "however it was built, it's still a person under all those stolen abilities." Somewhere in there is someone who never got asked what he wanted either. Himiko did not answer immediately, and when she finally did, her voice carried the weight of someone who had learned, over the past year, exactly how far a person could be pushed before they forgot they had ever had the right to want anything for themselves. Then that's the fight, isn't it, she said. Not just stopping him. Finding out if there's still enough of a person left inside all that stolen power to actually want something different, before Oki finds a way to make sure there never will be again. Neither of them moved from the steps for a long time after that, watching the still, patient figure at the edge of everything they had built, both of them fully aware that whatever the sanctum had become strong enough to survive so far, it had never yet been tested by an enemy who had already proven he was willing to unmake a person entirely in pursuit of the very thing Izuku had spent a year proving could only ever be given, never taken. Chapter 17. By mid-morning, the figure at the tree line had still not moved, and the sanctum had shifted from crisis footing into something more unsettling, a kind of watchful, exhausted waiting that Izuku suspected was exactly the response Oki had designed the demonstration to produce. Nizu spent the hours coordinating quietly with contacts inside the commission, careful not to reveal more about the sanctum's internal panic than necessary, while Mei worked without rest to expand the detection grid's range, determined never again to be caught flat-footed by something standing in plain sight. Mirko paced the length of the main hall so many times that Kendo eventually blocked her path bodily, informing her in no uncertain terms that wearing a groove into the floor accomplished nothing except making everyone else more anxious. It was Setsuna, quieter than usual since the conversation about her brother's vulnerability weeks earlier, who finally voiced the question sitting beneath everyone's nerves. What if he's not actually waiting for an attack order at all? What if Oki built him to wait exactly long enough for us to convince ourselves it's safe to stop watching? Nobody had a good answer to that, and the lack of one settled over the hall with the particular weight of a threat that could not be solved through strength alone. Izuku found himself thinking, again and again, about the message Oki had sent, its almost gentle phrasing, the deliberate cruelty of framing an unconsenting, manufactured weapon as proof of patience rather than proof of exactly the crime the sanctum had been built in opposition to. He is not patient, Izuku said finally, breaking a silence that had stretched long enough to feel dangerous in its own right. He wants us to think he is. He wants us exhausted, watching a door that might never open, while he works on something else entirely somewhere we're not looking. Rei's right that we shouldn't charge out there. But we also can't let this be the only thing we're paying attention to. It was, in its own way, the clearest thing anyone had said since the figure first appeared, and the council split its efforts accordingly. Rei and Kendo would maintain the watch at the northern boundary, prepared but not provoked. Mirko, still bound loosely by her commission obligations, would use those very obligations as cover to quietly investigate whether any of Oki's known associates had made unusual movements elsewhere in the city over the past several days. Nijire and Yui would work with the newer arrivals, making certain that whatever came next, no one inside the sanctum's walls was caught unprepared by their own untested abilities. Izuku, for his part, did the one thing he had always done best, long before any of this began, before a rooftop and a crying girl had changed the entire shape of his life. He opened his notebook, the same battered, familiar habit from a childhood spent cataloging heroes he had once believed he would never resemble, and began writing down everything he understood and did not yet understand about second chapter, every detail of the message, every visible detail of the layered Quirk signature Mei's sensors had captured, searching, the way he always had, for the pattern hidden inside an opponent that no one had yet learned to see. Himiko sat beside him through most of it, not speaking, simply present the way she had learned to be present for him during the hardest hours, and it was well past midday before either of them noticed that the figure at the tree line had finally, quietly, without any fanfare at all, disappeared. The sanctum did not celebrate that disappearance. Nobody in that hall believed, even for a moment, that it meant the threat had passed. It meant only that the demonstration had ended precisely when its architect decided it should, and that somewhere beyond the walls they had spent a year building higher and stronger with every passing threat, Dr. Kenji Oki was already moving toward whatever came next, patient in exactly the way his message had promised, and considerably more dangerous for having finally shown them, plainly and without disguise, what he was actually willing to build in order to win. Act 3. Chapter 18. 3 days passed after second chapter's disappearance from the tree line before the sanctum received any further word, and the waiting did more damage to morale than a direct attack might have, precisely because it left every resident alone with their own imagination about what was coming. Izuku spent most of those 3 days in the annex library, a small converted storage room that had slowly filled with donated books and printed research over the past year, cross-referencing everything Nizu's contacts could dig up about the old, defeated network that had once orbited All for One. Most of it was fragments, redacted files, second-hand testimony from villains who had been captured decades earlier and had only ever seen small pieces of a much larger operation, but patterns began to emerge regardless, the way patterns always eventually surfaced when Izuku gave a problem enough patient, obsessive attention. The old network had never been a single organization. It had been a web of independent brokers, researchers, and financiers, all of them orbiting All for One's ambitions without ever fully understanding the whole of what he intended, each of them convinced they were pursuing their own separate goals even as they fed, unknowingly, into his singular design. Oki, Izuku realized with a chill, was not simply a leftover fragment of that old structure. He had been close enough to its center to understand exactly how it had been built, and specifically enough to understand precisely where it had failed. He is not trying to become the next All for One, Izuku said, laying out his notes for the assembled council on the third evening. He's trying to fix the mistake that got the first one caught. All for One built his power by stealing directly, personally, one victim at a time, which meant every theft left a trail leading straight back to him. Oki is building it as a service instead. Layers of intermediaries, deniable contractors, and now apparently laboratory-built power stacks like second chapter, so that even if one piece gets exposed, nothing leads back to him directly. Nizu, listening with his paws steepled in the particular posture he adopted when a puzzle was finally beginning to resolve, nodded slowly. Which means our usual advantage, defeating whoever he sends and tracing the wreckage back to its source, will simply stop working the moment he perfects the model. We are not fighting a villain building an empire. We are fighting a man building a machine for building empires, one that could theoretically survive losing any single piece, including himself. The weight of that realization settled over the room slowly, and it was Rei who finally gave voice to the question underlying everyone's unease. Then how do you defeat a machine like that? You can't punch an idea any better than Mirko could punch that newspaper article. Mirko, despite herself, cracked a small, humorless smile at that. Izuku did not answer immediately. He was still turning the shape of the problem over, the way he had turned over 1,000 smaller problems in his old notebooks, searching for the specific flaw that every design, no matter how elegant, inevitably contained. You beat a machine the same way you beat anything that's supposed to be perfect, he said finally. You find the part of it that's still human, still capable of wanting something the design never accounted for, and you pull on that thread until the whole structure has to respond to it. Second chapter isn't a machine. He's a person Oki built to act like one. That's the flaw. That has to be the flaw. It was, Himiko thought privately, watching Izuku across the table with the same steady conviction that had carried her from a rooftop ledge to this room full of transformed women he had built a family out of, exactly the kind of answer only Izuku Midoriya could have arrived at. Not a plan to destroy an enemy, but a plan to save one, delivered with the same unshaken certainty that had once talked a frightened, quirkless girl down from the edge of a school roof. Chapter 19. The opportunity to test that theory arrived sooner than anyone expected, and in a form nobody had anticipated at all. It began with a call from Nijire, still working her official rotation as a licensed hero when the emergency broadcast came through, a warehouse fire in the city's dockside district that had rapidly escalated beyond what the local fire department's Quirk-assisted units could safely contain. Nijire had been first on scene, and it was her voice, tight with something far beyond ordinary professional urgency, that reached the sanctum's emergency line less than 10 minutes later. It's him, she said, breathless over the calm, the sound of structural collapse audible behind her words. Second chapter. He's here, he's pulling people out of the fire faster than my whole unit combined, and I don't think he's attacking anyone. I think he's actually trying to help. The council scrambled into motion immediately, though the debate over how to respond lasted only seconds before Izuku settled it with a certainty that left no room for argument. I'm going, he said. Not to fight him. To talk to him. If there's any truth to what I think Oki built into him by accident, this might be the only chance we get to reach it before Oki finds a way to correct for it. Mirko refused to let him go without an escort, a compromise Izuku accepted only because arguing against Mirko's protective instincts had never once, in the past year, produced a result in his favor. They arrived at the dockside warehouse 15 minutes later to find the scene exactly as Nijire had described, chaos and smoke and the controlled, methodical presence of a figure moving through collapsing structure with an ease that defied every law of danger the burning building represented. Second chapter was, up close, considerably younger looking than the grainy security footage had suggested, a boy who could not have been much older than Izuku himself, moving through fire and falling debris with the layered, borrowed abilities of a dozen different quirks stacked seamlessly into a single body, extinguishing flame with one gesture, reinforcing a collapsing support beam with another, pulling an unconscious dock worker free from beneath a fallen crate with a strength that belonged to none of the abilities visible on the surface. He turned to face Izuku the moment the immediate danger to civilians had passed, expression unreadable, and for a long, tense moment neither of them spoke, Mirko coiled and ready beside Izuku, watching for any hint of the aggression Oki's message had implied was inevitable. You are not what I was told to expect, second chapter said finally, his voice carrying an odd, careful flatness, the sound of someone speaking a language he had only recently learned to use for anything beyond simple commands. Dr. Oki said you would come with soldiers. Or with fear. You came instead to a burning building. You were helping people, Izuku said carefully. That's not something Oki built into you on purpose, is it? Something shifted in the boy's expression at that, subtle and uncertain, the specific confusion of someone confronting a question about his own motivations for what might have been the first time in his entire existence. I do not know why I came here, he admitted finally. I felt the fire before anyone reported it. Something in me recognized the danger and moved toward it before I had decided anything at all. Dr. Oki did not instruct this. I do not understand it either. It was, Izuku realized with a rush of something between hope and heartbreak, exactly the thread he had promised the council he would search for, the small, undesigned fragment of a person that had survived whatever process had built the rest of second chapter into a weapon. Whoever he had been before Oki's process began, some instinct toward protecting the vulnerable had apparently proven impossible to fully engineer away. That's not a malfunction, Izuku said, taking a careful step closer, ignoring Mirko's sharp, wordless warning beside him. That's you. Whatever Oki built on top of it, underneath all of that stacked power, there's still a person who runs toward a fire to save someone instead of away from it. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens because some part of you decided, all on its own, that this mattered. Second chapter said nothing for a long moment, staring at Izuku with an intensity that made the surrounding chaos of the fire scene seem suddenly distant and unimportant. When he finally spoke again, his careful, flat cadence had softened into something rawer, uncertain in a way that sounded, for the first time, unmistakably human. Dr. Oki says I do not have a self to protect. That I am a demonstration, not a person. He says the part of me that feels anything is simply an inefficiency he has not yet finished removing. He's wrong, Izuku said, without a single moment of hesitation. And I think you already know he's wrong, or you wouldn't be standing in the middle of a fire making sure nobody else gets hurt by it. Chapter 20. The conversation did not end cleanly. It could not, given everything standing between the boy who had once been simply a demonstration and the family Izuku had spent a year building on. The deliberate, careful practice of consent. Second chapter had never once been offered. He left before Izuku could say anything further, vanishing from the scene with a burst of speed drawn from some ability layered deep within his stacked collection, leaving behind only the lingering, unsettled quiet of a conversation that had opened a door without yet deciding whether either side of it was ready to walk through. Oki's response arrived within hours, delivered this time not as a threat but as something closer to genuine, clinical irritation, a message decrying Izuku's interference as reckless and destabilizing, warning that further contact with what he called his prototype would be treated as an act of aggression regardless of Izuku's intentions. The message confirmed, more clearly than anything before it, exactly how precarious Oki's control over his creation actually was. He's afraid, Nizu observed, reading the message twice with the particular sharpness he reserved for moments when an opponent's fear revealed more than their strength ever could. A man fully confident in his machine does not send an angry message minutes after a single conversation. Whatever safeguards he built into that boy to prevent exactly the kind of doubt Izuku just planted, they are apparently considerably less reliable than he would like us to believe. The council debated for the better part of a full day over how to proceed, torn between the obvious moral pull toward reaching a boy who had clearly never been given the chance to choose anything for himself, and the very real danger that any further contact might provoke Oki into a response considerably more violent than a strongly worded message. It was Yui, once again, whose quiet insight cut through the deadlock more effectively than any tactical argument. He came to that fire on his own, before anyone told him to, she said. Whatever Oki built to control him, it isn't complete. I think if we push too hard from the outside, Oki tightens his grip and we lose whatever chance we have. But if we just keep being visible, keep being exactly what we already are, maybe that boy finds his own way back to the door Izuku already opened, the same way I found my own way here, one small choice at a time, until eventually the whole shape of a life had changed without ever feeling like a single dramatic leap. It was a slower, less satisfying answer than anyone in the room wanted, but it carried the unmistakable ring of the same patient, deliberate philosophy the sanctum had built itself on from the very beginning, and in the end, the council agreed to it, reluctantly, understanding that some doors could only ever be walked through by the person standing on the other side, not pulled open by force from without. They did not have to wait long. Second chapter returned to the sanctum's northern boundary 4 nights later, alone, unannounced, standing at the exact spot where he had first appeared, though this time his posture carried none of the patient, hollow stillness it had before. He looked, Rei observed quietly through the compound's monitors, like someone standing at the edge of a decision he had not yet worked up the courage to finish making. Izuku went to him again, alone this time, over the anxious objections of nearly everyone at the sanctum, though he compromised by allowing Mei to fit him with one of her newly modified support devices, a small, discreet emergency beacon capable of summoning the entire compound within seconds if anything went wrong. He met second chapter at the tree lean in the cold, clear dark, and this time the boy spoke first, before Izuku had even fully closed the distance between them. I looked for the fire again, he said. After you left. I wanted to know if what happened at the warehouse was real, or if it was simply another function Dr. Oki had not yet catalogued. I have not found another fire. I have found, instead, that I keep thinking about the question you asked me. Whether some part of me decided, on its own, that any of this mattered. And what did you decide? Izuku asked quietly. Second chapter was silent for a long moment, staring past Izuku toward the distant, warmly lit windows of the sanctum's main hall, where the sound of quiet, ordinary conversation drifted faintly across the cold night air, Kendo's laugh distinguishable even at this distance, Setsuna's voice rising and falling in some unheard story. I do not know if I am allowed to decide anything, he said finally, and for the first time since Izuku had met him, his careful, engineered composure cracked entirely, revealing beneath it something raw and frightened and unmistakably young. I do not know if I am a person who can choose, or a machine designed to feel as though I am choosing, while every actual choice was decided for me before I ever opened my eyes for the first time. I do not know which one of those is true, and I do not know how to find out without Dr. Oki deciding the answer is dangerous and correcting it. Izuku did not have a clean answer to that, and he did not pretend to. He simply sat down on the cold ground at the edge of the tree lean, close enough to talk without demanding anything, and told second chapter the truth instead, the same truth his mother had made him promise on a kitchen table more than a year earlier, the same 3 rules that had built everything the sanctum had become since. I can't prove which one you are either, he said. Nobody can prove that about themselves, not really, not with any certainty that would satisfy a scientist like Oki. But I can tell you this. Whatever you are, machine or person or something nobody's ever had a word for before, you ran into a burning building to save people nobody told you to save. That's not proof. But it's a start. And starts are the only thing any of us ever actually get to work with. Chapter 21. Oki discovered the second meeting within a day, and his response this time abandoned entirely the careful, clinical distance he had maintained until now. The message that arrived at the sanctum was shorter than any before it, and considerably more direct. "You have contaminated my work," it read. "I will need to correct that. Do not expect further warnings." The correction arrived less than 72 hours later, not as an attack on the sanctum itself, but as a targeted assault on second chapter's ability to think clearly at all. A remote override, Nizu's contacts eventually confirmed, built into the very architecture Oki had used to construct him, capable of suppressing whatever fragile, undesigned sense of self had begun asserting itself since the warehouse fire. They knew something had gone wrong before any formal confirmation arrived, because Yui woke the entire sanctum in the middle of the night with a scream unlike anything anyone had heard from her before, describing a rawness radiating from beyond the walls so vast and so wrong that it felt, she said afterward, like watching a person get erased from the inside while they were still fully conscious of every second of it happening. Second chapter attacked the northern perimeter 40 minutes later, and this time there was no patient stillness in his approach at all, only a relentless, mechanical violence that bore no resemblance to the uncertain, searching boy who had sat at the edge of the tree line 3 nights earlier asking whether he was allowed to choose anything. May's detection grid, upgraded specifically to guard against exactly this kind of threat, gave the sanctum precious minutes of warning, but minutes were barely enough against an opponent capable of layering a dozen stolen abilities into a single, overwhelming assault. Mirko met him at the breach point, and for the first time in the compound's history, she found herself genuinely, desperately overmatched, every reinforced strike absorbed and returned with force drawn from abilities she had no answer for, her rapid healing barely keeping pace with damage that would have ended a lesser fighter within the opening exchange alone. Rei's ice constructs shattered against attacks that seemed to shift in nature with every collision, as though second chapter's borrowed powers were adapting in real time to counter whatever defense he encountered. It was Kendo, massive and immovable at the compound's main entrance, who finally slowed the assault's momentum, not through overwhelming force but through sheer, stubborn endurance, absorbing blow after blow that would have leveled the entire training yard on any lesser fighter, buying the precious seconds Nijire needed to bring her fully unleashed wave motion to bear on a target that finally, for the first time since the fight began, staggered under the impact. Izuku watched all of it from the observation room with a horror that had nothing to do with fear for himself and everything to do with the specific, devastating knowledge that the boy currently tearing through his family's defenses was, somewhere beneath Oki's override, the same frightened, searching person who had asked, 3 nights earlier, whether he was allowed to want anything at all. He did the only thing he could think to do, the same thing that had defined every decision he had made since a rooftop conversation more than a year earlier. He left the observation room, ignoring every frantic protest over the comm system, and ran directly into the middle of the fight, close enough that Mirko's shout of warning barely reached him before he had already closed the distance to where second chapter stood, momentarily staggered by Nijire's strike, eyes distant and unfocused in a way that had nothing to do with pain. He grabbed the boy's hand, the same simple, direct gesture that had once transformed a crying girl on a rooftop, and poured every ounce of sincerity he had into the single desperate thought underlying the gesture. Not a command. Not a demand. Simply a question, offered with the same honest, searching care he had offered every single person who had ever come to the sanctum before this. Do you want this? Any of this? Tell me the truth, and I promise I will believe you, whatever the answer is. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened at all, second chapter's borrowed strength still bearing down against Izuku's grip with enough force to shatter bone, and Izuku understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its certainty, that he might have made the single greatest miscalculation of his entire life. Then, somewhere beneath the override, beneath the layered, stolen power Oki had built without ever once asking permission, something answered. Not words. Not even a clear, defined thought. Simply the smallest, most fragile flicker of resistance, a single, undesigned spark of a person refusing, in the only way still available to him, to let the machine finish erasing whatever remained of who he actually was. The golden warmth answered that flicker the way it had answered every genuine, unguarded moment of connection Izuku had ever offered anyone, except this time it did not simply grant or restore. It reached into the tangled, stolen architecture Oki had built and found, underneath every layer of borrowed ability, the single thread of a person who had never once been asked what he wanted, and it held on to that thread with everything Izuku had. Chapter 22. The fight ended not with a final blow, but with a silence so sudden and so total that every combatant on the field froze in place, uncertain for several long seconds whether the stillness represented victory or catastrophe. Second chapter collapsed where he stood, Izuku's hand still locked around his wrist, both of them sinking to the churned, frost-scarred ground of the training yard together, and for a moment nobody moved, watching with held breath as the golden light finally faded from between them, leaving behind an unnerving quiet that seemed to stretch far longer than the seconds it actually lasted. He opened his eyes first, and the eyes that opened were nothing like the distant, overridden gaze that had torn through the sanctum's defenses only minutes earlier. They were frightened, and confused, and unmistakably, entirely present, the eyes of a person waking from a nightmare they had not fully escaped yet. "What did you do?" he whispered, voice cracking in a way his careful, engineered cadence had never once allowed before. "I could feel him. Dr. Oki. Inside my own thoughts, telling me what to want, and then you were there, and something pulled it out, and now I cannot feel him at all." Izuku, still shaking from the collision and the desperate gamble that had somehow, impossibly, worked, managed a small, exhausted smile. "I didn't take anything away that was actually yours," he said. "I think I just gave you back the only thing Oki never managed to build properly in the first place. A door he couldn't lock from the outside anymore." Rei was the first to reach them, checking second chapter for injury with the same careful, professional efficiency she had once applied to her own recovering hands, and it was Rei, gently, who asked the question everyone else was too stunned to voice yet. "What's your name?" "Your actual name, not the one Oki gave you." The boy who had been second chapter for the entirety of his short, engineered existence stared at her for a long moment, something fragile and searching crossing his face before he finally, quietly, admitted the truth underlying that simple question. "I do not have one. Dr. Oki never gave me a name meant to belong to a person. Second chapter was always meant to describe a project, not someone who could be asked what he wanted to be called." The silence that followed was not the tense, uncertain quiet of the fight's immediate aftermath. It was something gentler, and considerably more painful in its own way, the specific ache of an entire room full of people who had each, in their own time, discovered exactly what it felt like to finally be seen as someone worth naming, confronting a boy who had never once been offered that same basic dignity. It was Himiko, unsurprisingly, who broke the silence first, crouching down to his level with the same steady, unflinching directness she had carried since her own transformation. "Then we pick one," she said. "Not tonight, not if you're not ready, but whenever you are. Something that's actually yours. Something nobody gets to take back from you." He did not answer immediately, still processing the sheer, overwhelming novelty of being asked rather than assigned, but something in his expression shifted, subtle and uncertain, the first genuine flicker of a person beginning, however cautiously, to imagine a future that had not been designed for him by anyone else. The council gathered that same night, exhausted and battered but united in a way even the previous crises had not fully achieved, to discuss what came next. The boy could not simply be released back into a world that had never once considered him a person, nor could he be assumed automatically safe, given how thoroughly Oki had proven capable of overriding whatever fragile autonomy he had begun to build. But neither could he be treated as a threat to be contained, not after what Izuku had felt in that single desperate moment on the training yard, not after Rei's simple, devastating question had finally cracked open something Oki's entire design had been built to keep sealed. Mei, already deep in the technical details of exactly how Oki's override had functioned, proposed the beginning of an answer before the meeting had even fully concluded. "If I can map the architecture he used to reach into that boy's mind," she said, "I can build something to shield against it. Not perfectly, not immediately, but enough that Oki loses whatever leash he thinks he still has." It would take time, she admitted, considerable time, and there was no guarantee the shielding would hold against whatever refinements Oki inevitably developed in response, but it was, for the first time since second chapter had first appeared at the tree-line, a path forward that did not require anyone to be sacrificed, contained, or turned into a weapon in return. The boy who had been second chapter listened to the entire discussion in silence, sitting slightly apart from the rest of the gathered council in the manner of someone still uncertain whether he had actually earned a place among them, and it was only much later, after most of the sanctum had finally gone to whatever exhausted rest the night allowed, that he approached Izuku alone, On the same cliffside steps that had witnessed nearly every difficult, defining conversation the sanctum had ever had. "I think I want to try Haru," he said quietly, without preamble, the name offered with the particular fragile hope of someone testing whether a thing could truly belong to him before he allowed himself to believe it. "It means spring. I read it somewhere, in one of the files Dr. Oki kept about testing schedules. I do not know why it felt right. Perhaps because everything about what happened tonight felt like something ending, and something else, very small and very new, beginning instead." Izuku, more exhausted than he had been in the entire year since a girl's tears had first cracked something open in his chest on a different rooftop entirely, smiled at that, tired and genuine in equal measure. "Haru," he repeated, testing the shape of it, the way a person tests the weight of something newly, carefully given. "That's a good name. Welcome to the sanctum, Haru." Chapter 23. Oki's reaction to losing control of his most ambitious creation arrived not as fury, which the sanctum had half expected, but as something considerably colder, a lengthy, clinical message addressed directly to Izuku that read less like a threat and more like a scientist calmly revising a failed hypothesis. "You have proven something I did not anticipate," the message read. "That the bond your ability creates is resilient enough to override external control, provided the subject retains even the smallest fragment of independent will. This is valuable information. I intend to make use of it." Second chapter, or whatever name you have given him, was never more than a prototype. I have others considerably further along in development, and considerably more difficult to reach the way you reached him. The message went on to describe, in the same detached, academic tone, a facility Oki claimed to be operating somewhere beyond the reach of any current investigation, where a new generation of stacked power subjects were being refined specifically to resist the kind of intervention that had freed Haru. It read less like a boast and more like an invitation to a much larger, much more dangerous confrontation than anything the sanctum had faced so far. Haru, when shown the message, went very still, the particular stillness of someone recognizing details he had once been too deeply buried in Oki's control to fully register as monstrous. "There are others," he said quietly. "I remember now, pieces of it. I was not the first attempt. I was simply the first one stable enough to be sent out into the world. The ones being refined now, they are built from what Dr. Oki learned from every mistake he made building me." The weight of that revelation settled over the sanctum heavily, transforming what had felt, for one brief night, like a hard-won victory into the opening move of a far larger, far more urgent crisis. Somewhere beyond their reach, Oki was not simply planning revenge. He was mass-producing the exact horror the sanctum had spent a year proving was unnecessary, refining it specifically to withstand the one weakness Izuku had just exposed. Nizu, reviewing the message alongside every scrap of intelligence his commission contacts could gather, delivered the assessment nobody wanted to hear but everyone had already begun to suspect. "This is no longer a matter the sanctum can resolve alone," he said. "Whatever facility Oki is operating, however many subjects he has waiting there, this has become a matter for the full weight of the Hero Commission, whether either of us particularly enjoys admitting that or not." It was a difficult admission for a council that had spent the better part of a year proving it could stand on its own against everything Oki sent their way, but Izuku, watching Haru's carefully controlled fear at the mention of what awaited other subjects still trapped in whatever facility Oki operated, understood immediately that pride had no place in this particular decision. If there were others like Haru, frightened, engineered, and never once given the chance to be asked what they wanted, then the sanctum's usual patient, careful approach, powerful as it had proven against every threat so far, would simply not be fast enough to save them. "We need the Commission's resources," Izuku said finally, "and we need them without giving up everything we built to get them. That's the line. Whatever alliance we make here, it has to be exactly that. An alliance, not a surrender." Nizu's expression, for the first time in the entire conversation, carried something close to genuine admiration. "That," he said, "is precisely the negotiation I intend to have on your behalf, provided you trust me to conduct it without letting anyone inside that building forget for a single moment exactly who built the only working solution to a threat they have spent decades failing to fully eliminate on their own." The negotiation that followed took the better part of a week, conducted mostly through Nizu, with Izuku present only for the final, decisive session, and the terms that eventually emerged surprised everyone at the sanctum with how thoroughly they preserved the independence the compound had fought so hard to protect. The commission would provide resources, intelligence, and a joint task force to locate and dismantle Oki's facility, but the sanctum's residents would operate as partners rather than assets, retaining full autonomy over their own involvement, with Izuku's ability remaining, as it always had, entirely his own to offer or withhold. It was not, Mirko observed dryly when the terms were finally read aloud to the assembled council, the kind of deal the commission typically offered to anyone, let alone a group of transformed heroes operating largely outside their control for the better part of a year. Somebody in that building finally figured out which way the wind's actually blowing, she said. Better late than never, I suppose. Haru, listening to the entire arrangement with the careful, searching attention of someone still learning what it meant to have a stake in decisions this large, finally spoke up near the end of the discussion, his voice steadier now than it had been on the night Izuku first freed him, though still carrying the particular hesitance of someone unused to being asked for his opinion at all. I want to go, he said. To the facility. I know its layout, or at least the parts one remember. I know how Dr. Oki thinks, how his systems are built. And I know exactly what it feels like to be one of the ones still waiting there, hoping someone comes before whatever is left of who they were gets erased for good. Nobody in the room argued against it, though several exchanged glances that carried the specific, protective worry of people who had only just begun to think of Haru as someone worth protecting rather than something to be feared. Izuku met his eyes across the table and nodded once, slow and certain. Then we go together, he said. All of us. And this time, we're not just answering Oki's threats. We're ending them. Chapter 24. Locating Oki's facility took 11 days, a combination of the Commission's surveillance resources and Haru's fragmented, gradually surfacing memories eventually narrowing the search to an isolated research compound built into the side of a decommissioned mountain observatory nearly 200 kilometers from the sanctum, chosen, Nizu observed grimly, specifically for how difficult it would be for any conventional rescue operation to approach undetected. The joint task force that eventually assembled outside the facility's perimeter represented an alliance nobody at the sanctum would have believed possible a year earlier, commissioned tactical teams working alongside Mirko and Kendo, UA security specialists coordinating directly with Mei's rapidly evolving detection technology, and at the center of it all, Izuku Midoriya. Once dismissed as worth less than nothing by an entire system built around measuring human value through quirks alone, now standing as the single most valuable strategic asset in an operation designed to dismantle exactly the kind of exploitation that system had once nearly condemned him to accept as inevitable. Haru walked point through the facility's outer defenses, his memory of its layout proving accurate enough to bypass 3 separate security checkpoints before any alarm registered their presence at all. Though the deeper they moved into the compound, the more visibly tense he became, each familiar corridor apparently surfacing memories he had spent the better part of 2 weeks trying not to fully confront. They found the first holding chamber on the facility's second underground level, and the site inside stopped even Mirko, veteran of countless brutal commission operations, cold in the doorway. For subjects, suspended in various stages of the same stacked power process that had once built Haru, none of them fully conscious, all of them connected to machinery that hummed with the same layered, unnatural quirk signatures Mei's sensors had first detected at the sanctum's trillion weeks earlier. Haru moved to the nearest containment unit without hesitation, and though his voice shook, his hands did not, working through an unlock sequence he clearly remembered with the same fluent, engineered precision Oki had built into every other part of him. That is Subject 6, he said quietly, as the chamber's seal released and a young woman, barely conscious, slumped forward into his waiting arms. Dr. Oki called her that. I do not know if she remembers having any other name. The rescue of the 4 subjects took the better part of an hour, delicate, careful work that required Rei's medical knowledge, Nijire's steady hands, and the entire task force's coordinated patience to accomplish without risking further trauma to bodies and minds that had already endured considerably more than anyone should have to survive. Izuku knelt beside each of them in turn, offering the same simple, unhurried presence he had once offered Himiko on a rooftop, asking nothing, promising nothing except that whatever came next would finally for the first time in their engineered existence, be their own choice to make. Oki himself was not present in the holding chambers, and the deeper search that followed eventually revealed why. He had apparently anticipated the possibility of discovery for considerably longer than anyone had realized, and the facility's central research wing, when the task force finally breached it, had been stripped nearly bare, servers wiped, physical documentation reduced to ash in a hastily improvised incinerator, leaving behind only fragments too damaged for even Mei's considerable technical skill to fully reconstruct. He is gone, Nizu confirmed grimly, reviewing the wreckage of what had clearly once been the facility's primary command center. Whatever remained of his research, his contacts, his funding, all of it left with him, and left considerably before we ever arrived. This was never a battle we were meant to win outright. It was, at best, a rescue. It was, Izuku thought, watching the 4 freed subjects being carefully loaded into medical transport, exactly the kind of victory that felt simultaneously enormous and painfully incomplete, for lives saved from a horror that would have otherwise erased them entirely, and a man responsible for that horror still somewhere beyond their reach, presumably already rebuilding whatever remained of his ambitions in some new, better hidden location. Haru stood at the edge of the ruined command center for a long time after the last of the rescued subjects had been moved to safety, staring at the wreckage of the place that had built him, until Izuku finally came to stand beside him, offering nothing more than the same quiet, unpressured presence that had once cracked open the smallest, most fragile flicker of resistance inside him during the worst fight of the Sanctum's short, difficult history. He will not stop, Haru said quietly. Dr. Oki does not understand failure the way other people do. He simply revises the model and tries again. Whatever comes next, it will be built specifically to account for everything that went wrong here today. Then we'll be ready for that too, Izuku said, and though the words carried none of the false, easy confidence of someone who did not understand exactly how much they had already been forced to sacrifice to reach this single, incomplete victory, they carried something steadier and considerably more durable in its place. We built the Sanctum out of exactly this. Other people had already decided to give up on, choosing, over and over, not to be given up on after all. Whatever Oki builds next, we'll meet it the same way we met you. By asking what it actually wants, instead of assuming we already know. Chapter 25. The 4 rescued subjects arrived at the Sanctum 3 days after the raid on Oki's mountain facility, transported under careful medical supervision and settled into a newly converted wing of the annex that Mei and a hastily assembled construction crew had worked around the clock to prepare, uncertain until the very last moment whether any of the 4 would even wake enough to need it. They woke gradually, over the following week, each in their own time, and each waking carried its own particular grief layered beneath the relief of simple survival. Subject 6, whose name turned out, once memory slowly returned, to be Kaoru Ishida, wept for nearly an hour the first time Rei gently asked what she wanted to be called, not from sadness exactly, but from the sheer, disorienting novelty of being asked a question that assumed she was allowed to have a preference about anything at all. The other 3, designated only as subjects 2, 4, and 9 in whatever fragmented records the raid had managed to recover, proved considerably harder to reach. Subject 2, a boy who could not have been older than 13 when Oki's process began, retained almost no memory of a life before the facility at all, and spent his first days at the Sanctum flinching at sudden movements, watching every adult in the room with the particular, exhausted wariness of someone who had learned that kindness was frequently a prelude to something considerably worse. It was Yui, unsurprisingly, who found the way through to him first, not through words, which he seemed to distrust on some deep, wordless level, but through simple, patient presence, sitting near him without demanding conversation, letting her quiet ability to read and gently soothe emotional distress do the slow, careful work that no amount of direct reassurance could accomplish on its own. Haru spent nearly every waking hour with the 4 of them, driven by a guilt he could not fully articulate even to Izuku, the specific, aching responsibility of someone who understood, better than anyone else at the Sanctum, exactly what each of them had survived, because he had survived the earliest, cruder version of the same process himself. I do not know if I am the right person to help them heal, he confessed to Izuku one evening, watching through the observation window as Rei gently coaxed Kaoru through a simple breathing exercise meant to ease the anxiety that still gripped her without warning. I am also something Dr. Oki built. Perhaps I remind them too much of everything they are trying to forget. Izuku considered that carefully before answering, the way he considered most things now, weighing the specific weight of a person's fear against the deeper truth usually hiding underneath it. Or maybe you're proof it's actually possible, he said finally. Proof that whatever was done to all of you, it doesn't have to be the only thing that decides who you get to become afterward. I think that might matter more to them than anything the rest of us could say. He was right, though it took time to prove it. Subject 4. An older woman whose fragmented memories eventually surfaced enough to reveal a life as a hospital nurse before Oki's people had apparently identified her failing, undiagnosed heart condition as an opportunity too valuable to pass up, found her first real moment of connection not with Rei's careful medical patience or Yui's quiet emotional steadiness, but with Haru himself. The two of them sitting together in the sanctum's kitchen one evening, comparing notes on the strange, disorienting experience of relearning what it felt like to simply want something for its own sake rather than because a directive demanded it. You get used to it, Haru told her, with the particular hard-won honesty of someone only a few weeks further along the same difficult road. Wanting things again. It feels wrong at first, like you're not allowed, like someone's going to correct you for it. But eventually it stops feeling like theft and starts feeling like just being a person. Subject 9 proved the most difficult of all, a young man whose stacked abilities had apparently been furthest along in their development, and whose fragmented sense of self had correspondingly eroded the most severely under the weight of Oki's process. He spoke rarely during his first 2 weeks at the sanctum, and when he did speak, it was often in the same careful, engineered cadence Haru had once used before the golden warmth had cracked something open inside him during the fight at the tree-line. It was Izuku, patient in the exact same way he had been patient with every single person who had ever come to the sanctum seeking something they could not quite name, who eventually found the thread worth pulling. He did not offer Subject 9 his ability immediately, understanding by now that trust, not power, was always the foundation any of this had to be built on first. He simply sat with him, day after day, the way he had once sat with a crying girl on a rooftop, until eventually, nearly 3 weeks after his arrival, Subject 9 spoke a full, unprompted sentence for the first time. I think I remember liking the rain, he said quietly, staring out at the gray afternoon sky beyond the annex's reinforced windows. Before. I do not know why. But I think I liked the sound it made. It was, Izuku thought, exactly the kind of small, fragile beginning the entire sanctum had been built on from the very start, the same size and shape as Himiko's first tentative, disbelieving experiment with a stray patch of concrete more than a year earlier. Not a dramatic transformation. Simply the smallest possible proof that a person, however deeply buried, could still be found underneath everything that had tried to erase them. Chapter 26. Public reaction to the raid on Oki's facility, once the Commission's careful official statement finally cleared for release, proved considerably more complicated than the Sanctum's earlier victory over the media campaign had been. The rescue of 4 clearly traumatized, clearly exploited victims generated enormous public sympathy, exactly the kind of straightforward moral clarity that had been missing from Oki's earlier, more ambiguous accusations about consent and manipulation. But the revelation that one of the rescued subjects, Haru, had previously attacked the sanctum under Oki's control, and now lived there freely as one of its residents, reopened exactly the kind of uneasy questions about oversight and safety that the earlier documentary-style coverage had only barely managed to quiet. Several commission officials, according to Nizu's increasingly frayed sources inside the organization, argued forcefully that Haru and the 3 other rescued subjects should be remanded into formal government custody for study and evaluation rather than left in what they characterized as the informal, unregulated care of a compound that had already proven capable of housing at least one person originally built and deployed as a weapon. It was, Izuku recognized immediately upon hearing the argument secondhand, almost exactly the registry logic he had refused from the very beginning, dressed up this time in the language of protecting the public rather than efficiently allocating a resource, but functionally identical in the way it proposed treating people who had already suffered enormously as problems to be managed rather than survivors to be supported. The confrontation that followed, conducted this time in a considerably more public commission hearing than the quiet, private negotiations that had preceded the raid, tested the alliance Nizu had carefully constructed in ways the mountain facility rescue itself never had. Izuku sat before a panel of commission officials, Haru seated beside him at his own insistence, and made the argument he had been building, piece by piece, since the very first letter had arrived at his apartment door more than a year earlier. You are asking whether someone who was built without consent can be trusted with freedom, Izuku said, his voice steadier than he felt, aware of exactly how much weight this single conversation carried for 4 people who had already had every other choice stripped from them once. I would ask a different question. Whether an institution that has spent decades treating extraordinary ability as something to be registered, controlled, and rationed has ever actually earned the right to decide, on someone else's behalf, what freedom is safe enough to allow. Haru, when finally invited to speak for himself, offered testimony considerably more devastating in its quiet simplicity than any argument Izuku could have constructed on his behalf. I did not choose anything about what Dr. Oki built me to be, he said, addressing the panel directly despite the visible tremor in his hands. Not my abilities, not my name, not even, for a long time, the thoughts I believed were my own. I am only just now learning what it means to choose something, and I would ask this panel to consider very carefully whether taking that choice away from me again, even with the best of intentions, is truly so different from what was already done to me once before. The hearing did not resolve cleanly in the sanctum's favor, not entirely, and the compromise that eventually emerged, after 2 additional weeks of careful negotiation, reflected exactly the messy, imperfect nature of institutions attempting to balance genuine public concern against the very real danger of repeating old patterns of control under a new, more sympathetic name. The 4 rescued subjects would remain at the sanctum, but under a jointly monitored evaluation period, with regular, independently conducted wellness assessments designed to ensure their ongoing safety and autonomy, reviewed by a panel that, at Nizu's insistence, included representatives chosen by the sanctum itself rather than appointed unilaterally by the commission. It was not the clean, unconditional victory Izuku had hoped for, but it was, he came to understand over the following weeks, something considerably more valuable in the long run. The first formal acknowledgement by the Hero Commission that oversight and freedom were not necessarily opposites, that a system built around genuine consent could be verified and supported rather than dismantled and replaced with exactly the kind of control it had been built specifically to resist. Mirko, characteristically blunt in her assessment once the final terms had been settled, summarized the outcome in exactly the terms the entire sanctum privately felt but had been too diplomatically cautious to say aloud during the negotiations themselves. We didn't win because we were stronger than them, she said. We won because we were harder to argue with than the alternative they were offering. That's not nothing, kid. That's actually a pretty big deal, coming from people who've spent their entire careers assuming force was the only argument that ever mattered. Chapter 27. The weeks that followed the hearing settled into something the sanctum had rarely enjoyed in the entire, chaotic year and a half since Izuku's ability had first surfaced on a rooftop, a genuine, if fragile, period of calm. Kaoru Ishida, memory largely returned and steadily rebuilding a life she had once believed permanently stolen from her, began quietly assisting Rei with the medical care the sanctum's growing population increasingly required, finding, in the process, something like purpose in exactly the kind of nursing work Oki's people had once identified as a vulnerability worth exploiting rather than a calling worth respecting. Subject 2, who eventually, tentatively, chose the name Ren, spent most of his days shadowing Mei in her workshop, discovering an unexpected talent for mechanical work that gave him something concrete and controllable to focus on while the harder, slower work of healing continued underneath. Subject 4, whose actual name turned out to be Michiko Oda, resumed something close to her original calling almost immediately, working alongside Kaoru and Rei with a steady, practiced competence that seemed to anchor her more thoroughly than almost anything else the sanctum had tried. And Subject 9, who took the longest of all 4 to settle into anything resembling comfort, finally chose a name nearly 2 months after his arrival, offered quietly to Izuku on the same cliffside steps that had witnessed nearly every significant turning point in the sanctum's short history. Aim, he said. Because of the rain. Because I think I remember, now, that I used to like the sound of it before anyone ever decided what I was for. Himiko, watching the sanctum's population continue to grow and settle around her, found herself, in a quiet moment near the end of that peaceful stretch, turning the entire strange journey over in her mind the way she rarely allowed herself to anymore, too consumed most days by the practical, immediate work of simply keeping everyone safe. She had been, once, a girl standing on a rooftop ledge, certain the world had already decided everything worth deciding about her value. Now she stood at the center of something that had, without either of them ever quite intending it, become one of the most consequential institutions in the entire hero world. "Do you ever think about how small this started?" she asked Izuku one evening, the two of them sitting on the familiar steps while the sanctum's newest residents settled into an ordinary, unremarkable evening somewhere behind them, laughter and quiet conversation drifting faintly through the warm light of the main hall's windows. "Just you and me, and a rooftop, and neither of us knowing what any of it would turn into." Izuku considered that for a long moment, watching the last colors of sunset fade over the water. "I think about it constantly," he admitted. "I think about how easily it could have gone differently. If I hadn't been walking that exact street. If you hadn't happened to be exactly where I could hear you. This whole thing exists because of one small, ordinary moment neither of us planned. That's the part that scares me sometimes," Himiko admitted, quieter than usual. "Not Oki. Not whatever he builds next. Just how much of this, everyone we've saved, everyone who found somewhere to belong because of what happened between us on that roof, all of it hinges on something that could have just as easily never happened at all." Izuku reached over and took her hand, not with the golden warmth of his ability, which had never once answered between the two of them despite the depth of what they had built together, but simply as the specific, ordinary comfort of one friend reassuring another after more than a year of surviving impossible things side by side. "Then I guess we just have to keep making sure it was worth however it happened," he said. "Not because it was guaranteed. Because we chose, every single day since, to keep choosing it anyway." It was a fragile kind of peace, and both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, exactly how temporary it would eventually prove to be. Somewhere beyond the sanctum's walls, Dr. Kenji Oki remained at large, presumably already deep into whatever revised, more resilient version of his ambitions he intended to build next, and the 4 subjects rescued from his mountain facility represented, everyone at the sanctum understood with grim clarity, only a fraction of however many others might still exist in facilities nobody had yet located. But for one quiet evening, at least, the sanctum simply existed, exactly as it was meant to, a family built out of choice rather than obligation, gathered together against a darkening sky, unafraid, for however brief a stretch of time, of whatever the world still intended to throw at them. Chapter 28. The peace lasted almost exactly 6 weeks before the first sign of trouble arrived, and when it finally did, it came from a direction none of the sanctum's careful, hard-won intelligence network had thought to watch closely enough. It began with Mirko, still bound by her ongoing commission obligations even as her heart had long since settled permanently at the sanctum, receiving an unusual assignment through official channels, a routine security detail for a closed-door commission research symposium focused, according to the briefing materials, on advances in Quirk rehabilitation technology. She almost declined it outright, wary by now of anything connected even loosely to the kind of institutional research that had once produced men like Oki, but Nizu, reviewing the guest list Mirko forwarded him out of habit, went quiet in a way that made her cancel her other plans immediately. One of the invited speakers, listed under a research affiliation that did not appear in any commission database Nizu could access, carried a name that meant nothing to Mirko but stopped Nizu cold the moment he read it. Dr. Reiko Amasawa, a name Nizu recognized, after several tense minutes of searching through decades-old, heavily redacted archival records, as a former colleague of Kenji Oki's from the very same junior research project that had once studied All for One's captured work. She might know nothing, Nizu cautioned when he finally briefed the full council that evening, projecting the sparse, incomplete information he had managed to gather onto the main hall's briefing screen. Or she might be exactly the kind of connection Oki still maintains, quietly, through channels considerably harder to trace than the ones we've already dismantled. Either way, this is the first solid lead we've had on his current activities in nearly 2 months, and I do not believe in coincidences convenient enough to ignore. The decision to investigate further, rather than simply flag the connection and walk away, took considerably less debate than similar decisions once had, a testament, Izuku thought privately, to exactly how much the sanctum had grown and changed since the anxious, uncertain days following Furukawa's betrayal. Mirko would continue her assignment as planned, watching Amasawa carefully without revealing any unusual interest, while Nizu quietly expanded his research into her background, and Mei began the patient, technical work of determining whether any of the research Amasawa intended to present at the symposium bore the same distinctive signature as Oki's earlier work. It was Haru, listening to the entire briefing with the particular, focused attention he still brought to anything connected to his creator, who offered the detail that ultimately proved most useful. "I remember the name now," he said quietly, once Nizu had finished. "Dr. Oki mentioned her once, when he believed I was not paying close enough attention to remember it. He called her the only person who ever understood what he was actually trying to build, before the rest of the project decided his methods were too dangerous to continue." The symposium, when it finally occurred 4 days later, proved almost disappointingly ordinary on its surface, a collection of careful, heavily credentialed researchers presenting incremental advances in the kind of quirk rehabilitation science that genuinely, legitimately helped injured heroes recover lost function without any of the exploitation that had defined Oki's approach. Amasawa's own presentation, on the surface, concerned nothing more alarming than improved neural mapping techniques for quirk-related nerve damage, precisely the kind of legitimate research that made her affiliation with Oki's old project feel, for several tense hours, like it might simply be an old, irrelevant footnote rather than an active threat. It was only afterward, during the symposium's closing reception, that Mirko, following the specific, patient instincts that had made her one of the most effective heroes of her generation long before any of this began, noticed the brief, careful exchange between Amasawa and a man who did not appear on any official guest registry at all, a conversation lasting less than 90 seconds, conducted in the kind of quiet, controlled tone people reserved for things they very much did not want. Overheard. She could not get close enough to hear the actual content of the exchange without revealing her own surveillance, but she managed, through the kind of quick, discreet photography her support gear allowed, to capture a clear image of the unregistered man's face before he disappeared into the crowd and, according to the venue's security footage reviewed later that night, out of a side exit that led directly to an unmarked vehicle waiting exactly where the venue's cameras happened to have the least reliable coverage. Nizu ran the image through every database available to him, official and otherwise, and the eventual match, when it finally arrived 2 days later, confirmed exactly the fear that had been quietly building at the edges of the entire investigation since Amasawa's name had first surfaced. The unregistered man was a known financial intermediary, previously connected, through several layers of deliberately obscured shell transactions, to funding sources eventually traced back to the same fractured, deniable network that had once financed both Ishikawa's mercenaries and, everyone strongly suspected though could not yet prove, Oki's mountain facility itself. "He's rebuilding," Nizu said grimly, once the full picture had finally assembled itself. "Not recklessly. Not quickly. But he is rebuilding, through exactly the kind of careful, deniable structure that made him so difficult to catch the first time. And this time, I suspect, he has learned considerably more from his failures than we would like to believe." Chapter 29. The council convened that same night, later than usual, the weight of Nizu's confirmation settling over the sanctum with none of the immediate, adrenaline-fueled urgency of an active attack, but something slower and in some ways more exhausting, the specific dread of watching a threat everyone had hoped was finished quietly, patiently reassembling itself in the dark. "He learned from Haru," Izuku said, laying out the problem as plainly as he could for the assembled group. "He learned that stacking power without any fragment of genuine will left behind is unstable. So either he's found a way to remove that fragment entirely this time, which means whatever he builds next won't have the flaw that let us reach Haru at all, or he's found some other way to control it that doesn't depend on erasing the person underneath. Either possibility is worse than what we already dealt with once." Haru, who had grown steadily more confident in speaking up during council discussions over the preceding weeks, offered the observation that ultimately reframed the entire strategic conversation. "Dr. Oki does not believe in wasting a working theory," he said. "He believes in refining it. If stacking power without will is unstable, I do not think he abandons the concept of will entirely. I think he tries to build it in a way he believes he can fully control instead. Something that wants exactly what he wants it to want, instead of something with no wants at all." The implications of that settled over the room heavily. A subject built not as a hollow, overrideable weapon but as something with genuine, internally consistent motivation carefully, deliberately engineered from the ground up to align perfectly with Oki's own ambitions, would represent an entirely different, considerably more dangerous category of threat than anything the Sanctum had yet faced. Haru's freedom had come from finding a fragment of will Oki had failed to fully suppress. A subject built with will as the deliberate foundation, rather than an unwanted side effect, might have no such fragile seam to exploit at all. Rei, who had spent the better part of the evening listening carefully without contributing much, finally spoke, her voice carrying the particular weight of someone drawing on experience considerably older than anyone else currently in the room. "I have seen this pattern before, in a different form," she said. "Long before any of you were born, there were villains who believed devotion, properly engineered, made for a more reliable weapon than fear ever could. It rarely worked the way its architects intended. Genuine will, however carefully constructed, tends to develop in directions its creator did not anticipate, precisely because it is genuine. That is either our greatest danger in facing whatever Oki builds next, or our greatest opportunity, and I suspect we will not know which until we actually meet whatever he sends." It was, Izuku thought, exactly the kind of hard, uncertain truth the Sanctum had learned to build its entire philosophy around, the understanding that anything given genuine will, genuine choice, inevitably carried the possibility of choosing differently than its creator intended, precisely because that was what will actually meant. Oki, for all his careful, patient engineering, was attempting to manufacture something that contradicted its own nature by design, a devotion built to be reliable that could only ever be genuine, and therefore unreliable, in exact proportion to how successfully he built it. The Council's strategy, when it finally coalesced near midnight, reflected that same understanding. Rather than racing to locate and destroy whatever facility Oki had rebuilt, an approach that had already proven only partially successful the first time, the Sanctum would instead focus its efforts on becoming visible, deliberately, strategically visible, in exactly the way Oki's next creation would eventually need to encounter in order to develop any genuine will worth manufacturing at all. If devotion built from the ground up still required something to eventually devote itself to, the Sanctum intended to make absolutely certain that whatever alternative it offered, freedom, choice, a family built on consent rather than command, would be impossible to ignore once that new creation finally looked for it. "We're not just going to wait for him to come to us this time," Izuku said, closing the meeting with the same quiet, unshakable determination that had carried the Sanctum through every crisis before this one. "We're going to make sure that whoever he builds next, wherever he builds them, they know we exist. They know there's a door, even if Oki never tells them it's there. Because I don't think Rei's wrong. I think genuine will find its own way eventually, toward whatever it actually needs. We just have to make sure we're something worth finding." Chapter 30. Implementing that strategy proved considerably more complicated than articulating it, and the weeks that followed demanded a kind of patient, deliberate visibility the Sanctum had never previously attempted on this scale. Nizu coordinated a careful expansion of the Sanctum's public presence, not through the kind of defensive media campaign that had once countered Oki's earlier narrative attack, but through something considerably more proactive, a series of genuine, substantive contributions to the broader hero world that made the Sanctum's existence and philosophy impossible to overlook by anyone paying even passing attention. Mei's equipment enhancement discoveries, carefully vetted and shared through legitimate channels, began quietly transforming support gear used across dozens of hero agencies, each modified device carrying, in some small but undeniable way, the specific signature of Izuku's ability woven into its function. Nijire, still splitting her time between official hero duties and her home at the Sanctum, became something of an informal ambassador for the compound's philosophy, speaking increasingly often at Hero Academy panels and professional development seminars about what it meant to be given ability without cost, without obligation, without the quiet, corrosive debt that so many institutional structures still assumed was simply the natural price of extraordinary power. Her audiences, initially skeptical, grew steadily more receptive as her own visible, thriving example accumulated alongside the Sanctum's now well-documented record of consensual, carefully governed transformation. Haru, Aim, Ren, Kaoru, and Michiko, each in their own time and at their own carefully protected pace, began sharing pieces of their own stories as well, not publicly at first, and never without their explicit, ongoing consent, but gradually, through careful, controlled channels Nisa helped construct specifically to protect them from exactly the kind of exploitation their stories could easily have invited if handled carelessly. Their testimony, when it eventually reached wider audiences, carried a particular, devastating clarity that no amount of institutional messaging from either the Commission or the Sanctum itself could have matched: the simple, unadorned truth of 5 people who had been built, used, and ultimately reclaimed, describing exactly what the difference between those two states actually felt like from the inside. It worked, slowly, in ways that were difficult to measure precisely but impossible to entirely deny. Letters continued arriving at the Sanctum, as they always had, but their content began shifting subtly, alongside the familiar requests from the quirkless and the injured, occasional fragments of testimony from people who described strange, unexplained encounters, brief conversations with strangers who asked pointed, careful questions about consent and choice before vanishing again, encounters that Nizu, cross-referencing dates and locations with painstaking care, began to suspect might represent exactly the kind of searching, uncertain will Oki's newest creations were apparently beginning to develop on their own. The first confirmed contact came nearly 3 months after the symposium, in the form of a young woman who arrived at the Sanctum's gates alone, on foot, carrying nothing but the clothes she wore and a hunted, wary alertness that Izuku recognized immediately from his own memory of Haru's earliest days among them. She did not attack. She did not demand anything. She simply stood at the gate, exactly as Haru once had, and asked, in a voice carefully controlled but unmistakably frightened underneath its composure, whether it was true that this was a place where a person got to choose what they wanted to be. Her name, she eventually revealed once Rei and Haru together had coaxed enough trust from her to make the question answerable, was Subject 14, though she confessed, with a fragile, searching honesty that reminded everyone present painfully of Haru's own earliest days at the Sanctum, that she did not yet know if that was truly her name or simply the only thing she had ever been called. "We'll figure that out together," Izuku told her, the same promise he had made to every single person who had ever come to the Sanctum seeking something they could not quite name, extended now to someone who represented both the Sanctum's greatest fear and, in this single, hopeful moment, its clearest possible proof that its strategy was working exactly as intended. Whatever Dr. Oki built you to want, you're allowed to want something else instead. That's the only rule that's ever really mattered here. Later that night, standing once more on the cliffside steps that had witnessed nearly every defining moment of the Sanctum's short, extraordinary history, Izuku found himself surrounded by nearly everyone who called the compound home, gathered quietly in the aftermath of the newest arrival's careful, tentative welcome, and he understood, with a clarity that felt both hard-won and strangely peaceful, exactly what the shape of the fight ahead was going to be. Oki was not simply building weapons anymore. He was, whether he fully understood it yet or not, building people, and people, however carefully engineered, however deliberately constructed towards some specific intended purpose, retained an obstinate, ungovernable capacity to want something entirely different than what they had been built for. The Sanctum's entire existence stood as living proof of exactly that truth: a family built one impossible, hard-won choice at a time, out of people the rest of the world had already decided were finished, and Izuku understood, watching the newest, frightened, hopeful arrival slowly begin to relax in Haru's careful, patient company, that as long as the Sanctum kept offering that same door, kept asking the same simple, dangerous question that had started everything on a rooftop more than a year and a half earlier, Oki would eventually run out of subjects willing to stay exactly what he had built them to be. The fight was far from over. Somewhere beyond the walls he had spent a year and a half building higher and stronger against every threat the world sent his way. Dr. Kenji Oki remained free, patient, and considerably more dangerous for everything he had already learned from his failures. But for the first time since second chapter had first appeared, silent and unmoving, at the edge of the tree-line, Izuku Midoriya found himself facing that ongoing, uncertain future without fear, because he finally, fully understood the one advantage no amount of stolen, stacked, engineered power would ever be able to replicate. A family that chose him back every single day, simply because they wanted to. Thanks for listening.